So, here's something worth sitting with tonight. In 1839, an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens and an English artist named Frederick Catherwood hired mules and local guides and hacked their way through the jungle of western Honduras, following rumors of ancient ruins hidden in the forest. What they found stopped them in their tracks. Stone pyramids, 60 feet high, covered in carved hieroglyphs that neither of them could read. Plazas paved with stone, overtaken by roots and vines. Altars with portrait sculptures of rulers whose names had been forgotten for 800 years. Stephens described the experience of standing in the ruins of Copan as encountering a city that had been overthrown and left desolate, found by chance, its name lost, its history unknown. He asked the local people about the ruins. Nobody knew who had built them. Nobody claimed a connection. The civilization, it seemed, had simply vanished. Except it hadn't. The descendants of the people who built Copan were living all around Stephens and Catherwood, farming the same soil, speaking languages directly descended from the ones carved into those stone monuments. They didn't know the specific history of Copan, because the political system that had produced those monuments had ended 9 centuries earlier. But they were the same people. Same genetic lineage, same linguistic family, same agricultural practices. They hadn't gone anywhere. Right now, as you're lying there are roughly 6 million people in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras who speak Mayan languages. Not languages descended from Mayan, not languages influenced by Mayan. Mayan languages, direct and unbroken, passed from parent to child across more than 100 generations. These people cook with techniques their ancestors used 1,000 years ago. They mark time with calendar systems older than most European nations. They tend milpa gardens, corn, beans, squash, growing together in the same plot. In arrangements so ancient that the very soil remembers the pattern. In the highlands of Guatemala, Maya women weave textiles using backstrap looms that are functionally identical to those depicted on painted pottery from the 8th century. The patterns change. The technique doesn't. It's been continuous for over 1,200 years. And yet, if you open almost any popular history book and turn to the chapter on the Maya, you will find a section called The Collapse. Sometimes it's called The Mysterious Disappearance. Sometimes the Great Maya Collapse, as if it were a single dramatic event, a curtain falling on a stage. The word collapse implies something sudden and total. It makes you think of buildings crashing down, of silence spreading over abandoned cities, of a people simply ceasing to exist. And there is something seductive about that image. A great civilization reduced to jungle-covered ruins. Stone pyramids swallowed by roots and vines. The whole thing wrapped in a tidy mystery that a 20-minute documentary can neatly package between commercial breaks. But here's the thing. Those 6 million people never got the message that they were supposed to have disappeared. And the Maya are far from a special case. The people of Angkor, whose city was the largest on Earth before the Industrial Revolution, didn't vanish when they abandoned their temples. They moved 250 kilometers south and built Phnom Penh, which is the capital of Cambodia today. The Ancestral Puebloans didn't evaporate from Chaco Canyon. They walked south and east and became the Hopi and the Zuni, who will tell you exactly where their grandparents came from if you ask. They have oral histories that mention specific places. They have words for those ruins. They remember. The people of the Indus Valley didn't die when Mohenjo-Daro emptied out. They migrated east toward the Ganges, carrying practices and memories that surface in later Indian civilization, like threads in an old tapestry that never fully unraveled. And the Rapa Nui of Easter Island, the people we've been told, destroyed their own environment in a cautionary parable of ecological suicide. Those people are still living on the island. 7,800 of them, still speaking their language, still telling their stories, still very much alive. So tonight, we're going to do something a little different from the usual story about ancient civilizations. We're not going to tell the story of civilizations that collapsed. We're going to ask why we use that word in the first place, what it hides, what it distorts, and what actually happened to the people who supposedly vanished from history. Because here are the questions I want you to carry through everything that follows. They're the questions that will come back again and again, in different forms, as we move through each story. When we say a civilization collapsed, what exactly collapsed? The buildings? The government? The people? And why do we keep using a word that implies total destruction, when, in case after case, the people survived? What if some of those collapses weren't catastrophes at all, but choices? Painful, constrained, difficult choices, but choices nonetheless. What if the farmer who stopped hauling stone for the king's pyramid and walked away into a simpler life was making the most rational decision available to him? And what does it mean for us, right now, living in our own complex, interconnected, resource-intensive civilization? What does it mean if the past teaches us not that civilizations inevitably die, but that people inevitably adapt? Let's find out. Slowly. No rush. We've got all night. Let's start with the word itself. Collapse. Say it out loud and you can almost hear the building falling. There's a finality to it. A thud. It comes from the Latin collapsus, meaning to fall together, to crumble inward. And when you apply it to a civilization, it carries all of that weight. The implication is clear. Something that was standing is now rubble. Something that was alive is now dead. The story is over. The word entered the conversation about ancient societies through a specific door. For a long time, the big question in Western historical thought was, why did Rome fall? And from that question, a whole vocabulary grew up. Decline, fall, collapse, catastrophe. Edward Gibbon published The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire starting in 1776, and the title alone shaped how educated Europeans thought about the end of complex societies for the next 200 years. If Rome, the greatest civilization the West had ever known, had fallen, then surely this was the fate of all great civilizations. Rise, peak, fall. It seemed like a natural law, as inevitable as gravity. And for generations, when archaeologists encountered the remains of abandoned ancient cities, they reached for the same vocabulary. When John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood hacked through the Yucatan jungle in the 1840s and found the ruins of Copan and Palenque, they described the Maya in terms borrowed directly from the Roman analogy. A once great civilization that had mysteriously declined and fallen. When Mohenjo-Daro was excavated in the 1920s, the first interpretations framed its abandonment as a catastrophic collapse, possibly caused by invading Aryans. When the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was studied in the early 20th century, scholars described it as a collapse, period, end of story. The word became a lens, and everything seen through it looked the same: sudden, catastrophic, final. But something interesting has been happening in archaeology over the last few decades. Slowly, painstakingly, through better dating techniques, through climate data pulled from lake sediments and tree rings, and ice cores and cave formations, through DNA analysis and more careful attention to what happened after the cities emptied out, researchers have been assembling a picture that doesn't fit the word. What they're finding, again and again, is that the dramatic collapse narrative obscures something far more interesting and far more complicated. Take a simple question. When we say a civilization collapsed, what exactly do we mean? Think about it for a moment. The word seems clear, but try to pin down what it actually refers to. Do we mean the buildings fell down? Sometimes, but not always. Many collapsed cities have buildings that are perfectly intact. The great houses at Chaco Canyon still stand after 900 years. The temples of Angkor are structurally sound after 8 centuries. These buildings weren't destroyed, they were abandoned. That's a very different thing. Do we mean that people died? Almost never, as it turns out. In nearly every documented case of civilizational collapse, the population didn't vanish. It dispersed, migrated, reorganized, adapted. The death rates were sometimes elevated. Droughts and wars do kill people, but outright extinction is vanishingly rare. The people of the classic Maya cities didn't die. They moved to different places and continued living as Maya. Do we mean the political system ended? Often, yes. Kings stopped ruling, bureaucracies stopped functioning, taxes stopped being collected, monumental constructions ceased. But political systems end all the time in history, without anyone calling it a collapse. France went from absolute monarchy to republic to empire to republic again, all within a single century, and nobody describes that as the collapse of French civilization. We call it political change. So what exactly collapses? The question is more than semantic. It affects research priorities, public understanding, and even policy. If you tell people that the Maya collapsed, they hear extinction. They hear total failure. They hear a morality tale about what happens when a civilization overreaches. And they draw a straight line from that morality tale to our own situation. Climate change, resource depletion, political division. And they think, we're next. The collapse narrative generates fear. And fear, while it can be motivating, is also blinding. It makes people look for the one big cause, the one dramatic moment, the one catastrophic failure. It makes them miss the slow, complicated, multi-causal, deeply human processes that actually drive historical change. Here's where it gets interesting. What usually disappears is a specific kind of complexity, the elaborate, interconnected, resource-intensive systems that make a complex society function at its highest level. The centralized government, the monumental architecture, the long-distance trade networks, the professional military, the administrative bureaucracy, the state-sponsored religion. Those are the things that tend to fall away, and they fall away not necessarily because some external force destroys them, but because in many cases, the people who were supposed to maintain them simply stopped maintaining them. They stopped building pyramids. They stopped paying taxes to a distant capital. They stopped hauling stone for temples. They stopped supporting an elite whose demands had grown heavier, while the benefits of belonging to the system had grown lighter. In a profound sense, they walked away. And that walking away, that quiet, undramatic, deeply human act of deciding that the cost of maintaining a system has exceeded the benefit of belonging to it, is the thread that runs through almost every story we're going to explore tonight. An anthropologist named Joseph Tainter published a book in 1988 called The Collapse of Complex Societies, and it remains one of the most important works on this subject ever written. Tainter's argument is deceptively simple, but once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. He says that human societies become complex as a problem-solving strategy. You have a problem. You need to irrigate more land, or defend against a new enemy, or manage a growing population, or mediate disputes between competing groups. And you solve it by adding a layer of organization. You build a canal system. You raise a standing army. You create a bureaucracy to collect taxes and redistribute resources. You establish a state religion to provide ideological cohesion. Each new layer of complexity solves the immediate problem, and for a while, the returns on that investment are excellent. The canal feeds more people. The army keeps enemies out. The bureaucracy coordinates activities across a wide area. The religion gives people a shared identity and a reason to cooperate. But here's what Tainter noticed, and it's the kind of observation that seems obvious once someone points it out, but that almost nobody had articulated clearly before. Over time, the returns on each additional unit of complexity diminish. The first canal transforms a dry landscape into productive farmland. The return is enormous. The 10th canal extends cultivation into more marginal land, still useful but less transformative. The 50th canal irrigates land so marginal that it barely produces enough to justify the labor of maintaining it. The army that once defended a small frontier now polices a vast empire at staggering cost. The bureaucracy that once consisted of a handful of scribes now employs thousands of officials who spend most of their time managing each other. Think about this in terms you might recognize. Imagine you're heating a cold room. The first 10 degrees of warmth make the difference between being miserable and being comfortable. Enormous return on investment. The next 5 degrees are nice, from comfortable to cozy. Still worth it. The next 2 degrees, you barely notice them. But the energy required to push the temperature up by those 2 degrees might be just as much as the energy that got you the first 10. At some point, you're spending more and more for less and less. You're running just to stand still. And if you try to turn the heat up further, to solve new problems by adding yet more complexity, you find that the incremental benefit is almost zero, while the incremental cost is enormous. You're trapped on the wrong side of a curve that only goes in one direction. And if the fuel gets scarce, if a drought hits, if the trade routes close, if the population that's doing the work starts shrinking, you find yourself pouring everything you have into maintaining a level of complexity that's barely giving you anything back. When that happens, Tainter argues, collapse, or more accurately, rapid simplification, becomes the rational response. The system has passed the point of diminishing returns. Maintaining it costs more than abandoning it, and the people who are bearing those costs, the farmers, the laborers, the soldiers, the ordinary citizens who are paying taxes and doing corvée labor to keep the whole apparatus running, those people start doing the math, consciously or instinctively, and the math tells them to walk away. The farmer who stops hauling stone for the king's temple and instead focuses on feeding his own family is not being lazy or disloyal. He's making a rational decision based on the available information. The cost of supporting the system, his labor, his crops, his time, has exceeded the benefit he gets from it. Protection, trade access, social services, spiritual meaning. When enough farmers make that calculation and act on it, the system loses its base of support. And without that base, the whole elaborate structure, the temples, the roads, the armies, the bureaucracies, becomes unsustainable. Multiply that decision by tens of thousands of families across a region, and you get what looks, from the outside, from the perspective of later archaeologists staring at empty ruins, like a mysterious catastrophe. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people living through it, it might have felt like something much closer to relief. Consider the Western Roman Empire through this lens, because it's the example Tainter examines most thoroughly. In the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, Rome faced escalating military threats along its frontiers. The response was to enlarge the army, which required higher taxes, which required a larger bureaucracy to collect them, which itself had to be paid for, which required still higher taxes. At the same time, the empire was building roads, aqueducts, defensive walls, and administrative centers across an ever larger territory, all of which required maintenance. By the 5th century, the tax burden on Roman citizens, particularly farmers in the provinces, had become crushingly heavy. Historical sources describe people fleeing from Roman territory into barbarian lands, or welcoming barbarian invasions, because life under barbarian rule was less economically punishing than life under the Roman tax system. They were walking away from Rome, not because they hated Roman culture, but because the cost of Roman complexity had become unbearable. When the Western Empire finally fragmented in the 5th century, what replaced it wasn't chaos. It was simpler political organization, smaller kingdoms, less bureaucracy, less taxation, less monumental construction, but also less burden on ordinary people. The fall of Rome freed millions of people from a system that had been extracting more from them than it was giving back. That doesn't mean the transition was painless. The breakdown of trade routes, the decline of urban infrastructure, the loss of literacy in some regions, these had real costs. But the equation wasn't as straightforward as civilization good, collapse bad. Think about that for a moment. We've been trained to think of collapse as tragedy, as failure, as the worst thing that can happen to a society. But what if, for many of the people actually living in some of these civilizations, the end of the complex system was the moment they finally got to stop carrying a burden that had become unbearable? What if the ruins we find so hauntingly beautiful were, to the people who left them, something more like a bill they were tired of paying? That's a disorienting thought. And I don't want to push it too far, because real suffering was involved in many of these transitions. People did die from drought. Wars did destroy communities. The simplification of a complex society can be wrenching, disorienting, even dangerous. A bankruptcy might be the rational financial decision, but that doesn't mean it's painless. The analogy holds. Collapse can be both rational and agonizing at the same time. But the framing matters. The word we use to describe what happened shapes what we think happened, which shapes what we think it means for us today. So, let's set the word collapse aside for now. Let's not use it as a starting point. Let's instead look at what actually happened, case by case, with as much specificity and as little assumption as possible. And let's start with the oldest documented example we have of an interconnected world falling apart. A world so tightly woven together that when one thread snapped, the entire fabric began to unravel. A world that existed more than 3,000 years ago, along the shores of the eastern Mediterranean and into the ancient Near East. A world that in some surprising ways looked a lot like ours. Picture the Mediterranean world around 1300 BC. Not the Mediterranean you might be imagining. Sleepy fishing villages, whitewashed walls, tourists on beaches. This Mediterranean is a superhighway. The busiest, most interconnected trading network the world has ever seen up to that point. Ships crisscross it constantly, carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, possibly from as far away as Afghanistan or even Cornwall, gold from Egypt, ivory from Africa, timber from the mountains of Lebanon, olive oil from Crete, fine pottery from Mycenaean Greece. It's a globalized world, and the people living in it know it. They depend on it. Their entire way of life is built on the assumption that the network will keep functioning. At the center of this web sit the great powers, the superpowers of the late Bronze Age. Egypt, under the last great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, Ramesses II, Merneptah, Ramesses III. The Hittite Empire, controlling most of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and reaching deep into Syria. Mycenaean Greece, with its fortress palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Babylon, Assyria, and a constellation of smaller but wealthy kingdoms along the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, that served as crucial middlemen in the network, managing the flow of goods between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. We know about the relationships between these powers in extraordinary detail, thanks to one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. In 1887, in the Egyptian village of Tel El Amarna, a local woman digging for sabak, decomposed mud brick used as fertilizer, stumbled across a cache of clay tablets. Hundreds of them. They turned out to be diplomatic letters written in Akkadian cuneiform, the lingua franca of international relations in the late Bronze Age, exchanged between the Egyptian court and its allies, vassals, and trading partners across the entire Near East. The Amarna letters are one of the most extraordinary windows into any ancient world. They read like diplomatic cables, They are full of complaints, flattery, requests, and veiled threats. One Babylonian king writes to the pharaoh asking for more gold, noting with pointed politeness that gold is like dust in your country, and that the pharaoh really ought to be more generous. Another king asks for a skilled physician to be sent to his court. His own doctors apparently aren't up to the task. A Hittite queen writes to the pharaoh after her husband's death, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her and become king of the Hittites. She adds remarkably, "I am afraid," one of the most human, vulnerable lines in all of ancient literature. And a vassal in the city of Byblos, a man named Rib-Hadda, writes letter after letter, more than 60 of them over the course of years, begging Egypt for military help against encroaching enemies. Each letter is more desperate than the last. "Send archers," he writes. "Send help immediately." He warns that if Egypt doesn't intervene, the entire Levantine coast will be lost. You can hear the anxiety mounting through the clay, letter after letter, a man watching his world shrink and shouting into what increasingly feels like a void. And this web of correspondence tells us something crucial about how the late Bronze Age world worked. It was a system, an interconnected, interdependent system in which each part relied on the others. Egypt needed timber from the Levant because Egypt had almost no trees suitable for building ships and monumental architecture. The Hittites needed grain from Egypt because their own agriculture, dependent on rainfall across the Anatolian plateau, was vulnerable to drought. Cyprus needed markets for its copper. Everyone needed tin, which came from sources so distant, Central Asia, possibly even further, that the supply chain stretched thousands of miles through multiple intermediary kingdoms. Cut one link in that chain, and every kingdom downstream would feel it. To understand just how interconnected this world was, consider a single shipwreck. In 1982, a sponge diver off the coast of southern Turkey spotted what turned out to be a late Bronze Age merchant vessel resting on the seafloor near Uluburun. The ship had sunk around 1300 BC, and the cargo it carried reads like a manifest of the entire Eastern Mediterranean trading system. 10 tons of Cypriot copper in the form of distinctive oxhide-shaped ingots. A ton of tin, probably from Central Asia. Jars of terebinth resin from the Levant, used in perfume and incense. Ebony from Egypt. Ostrich eggshells from North Africa. Hippopotamus ivory, elephant ivory, amber from the Baltic, cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, Egyptian gold jewelry, Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite amphorae, raw glass ingots from Egypt or the Levant. All on a single ship. All in transit on a single voyage. The Uluburun wreck is a snapshot of a world in motion, a world where goods and materials from a dozen different regions converged in the hold of a single vessel. If that ship had reached its destination, probably a Mycenaean port, its cargo would have been unpacked, sorted, and redistributed across another set of networks, reaching workshops and palaces and temples across the Aegean. The loss of that single ship would have been felt in Cyprus, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, wherever the goods were expected. Now imagine dozens of those ships failing to arrive. Imagine the routes becoming unsafe, the harbors burning, the trading partners disappearing. The ripple effects would have been enormous. Eric Klein, who has studied these networks in meticulous detail and wrote one of the defining books on the period, called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, describes this as a complex, interconnected, interdependent world system. And his central argument is that no single factor brought it down. There was no one villain, no single catastrophe. Instead, what happened was more like what modern systems theorists call a cascading failure. Multiple stresses hit multiple nodes in the network at roughly the same time, and the system, which was designed to function as an integrated whole, couldn't absorb them all simultaneously. Let's walk through the stresses one by one, because the picture that emerges is far more nuanced and far more interesting than the standard barbarian invasion narrative that dominated older accounts. First, climate. Paleoclimatologists studying pollen cores from the Sea of Galilee, sediment records from the Eastern Mediterranean, and isotopic data from cave formations in Israel and Turkey have found evidence of a significant and prolonged drought beginning around 1250 BC and intensifying over the following decades. This wasn't a single bad year. It was a decades-long drying trend that would have reduced agricultural yields across the entire region. The Hittite kingdom, which depended almost entirely on rain-fed agriculture, they didn't have the Nile, was particularly vulnerable. We have a letter from a Hittite king to the pharaoh, explicitly requesting emergency grain shipments. "It is a matter of life and death," he writes. A king begging for food. That's not a letter you write when things are going fine. Second, earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on some of the most active fault lines on the planet. The boundary between the African and Anatolian tectonic plates runs right through the region, and archaeologists have found destruction layers at multiple sites: Mycenae, Tiryns, Medea, Knossos, Ugarit, Hattusa, and others that are consistent with major seismic events during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Earthquakes don't just knock buildings down, they destroy critical infrastructure. Water systems, defensive walls, storage facilities, harbour installations that takes years and enormous resources to rebuild. In a society already stressed by drought, an earthquake becomes not just a disaster but a financial catastrophe. You can't rebuild the walls and feed the army and maintain the trade routes all at the same time. Something has to give. Third, internal rebellions and political instability. Several texts from this period mention uprisings, succession disputes, and provincial revolts. The Hittite Empire was racked by dynastic infighting in its final decades. Egypt faced its own problems. The famous Turin strike papyrus records that workers at the royal tombs in Deir el-Medina went on strike around 1152 BC because their grain rations hadn't been delivered on time. Think about what that means. The mightiest kingdom in the Mediterranean couldn't pay the workers who were building its pharaoh's final resting place. The grain wasn't there. The system was fraying from inside. And fourth, the part that gets the most attention and has been the most misunderstood, the Sea Peoples. Egyptian texts from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe waves of attackers arriving by land and sea from across the Mediterranean, destroying cities along the Levantine coast and threatening Egypt itself. Ramses III claims to have defeated a major coalition of Sea Peoples in a land and naval battle around 1177 BC. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu displays enormous carved reliefs showing the battle in dramatic detail. Egyptian soldiers grappling with enemy warriors, enemy ships capsizing, prisoners being marched away in chains. For more than a century, the Sea Peoples were cast as the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. Mysterious barbarian invaders swooping in from some unknown homeland to destroy civilization. It made for a clean, simple narrative. External enemy, dramatic battles, civilizational death. But recent scholarship, Klein's included, has complicated that picture enormously. The Sea Peoples don't appear to have come from outside the system. Their names, as recorded in Egyptian texts, the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, correspond to groups that were already known within the Eastern Mediterranean world. The Peliset are almost certainly the Philistines, who appear to have originated in the Aegean region, possibly Crete or the western coast of Anatolia. The Shekelesh may be connected to Sicily, the Luca to southwestern Anatolia. These weren't aliens, they weren't outsiders. They were displaced populations from within the system itself. people whose own homes and livelihoods had been disrupted by the same combination of drought, earthquake, political breakdown and economic disruption that was hitting everyone else. They weren't the cause of the collapse, they were a symptom. They were the human wave thrown up by a system that was already breaking apart from the inside, people moving in desperation because staying where they were had become impossible, looking for new land, new resources, new places to settle, often willing to fight for them because they had no other option. And Klein makes another point that deepens this picture. The Sea Peoples weren't one group. They were a coalition of disparate, displaced populations who came together, perhaps temporarily, perhaps out of shared desperation, and moved as a wave through the Levantine coast. Some of them settled peacefully, some of them fought, some of them were absorbed into existing populations. The Peliset, after their conflicts with Egypt, ended up in the southern Levant, in the coastal plain of what's now Israel and Palestine. Within a few generations, they had built cities, adopted local customs while retaining some Aegean cultural elements, and become the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. They weren't destroyers, they were survivors, resettling in a world that had been broken. Let's follow the destruction sequence itself, because it's instructive. It doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds over roughly 50 years, from about 1225 to 1175 BC, and it moves geographically. First, the Hittite Empire fragments. The capital, Hattusa, in central Anatolia, is burned and abandoned around 1180 BC. The fire was so intense that some mud brick walls were vitrified, turned to glass by the heat. But who burned it? There's no clear evidence of foreign attackers at Hattusa. Some archaeologists believe the city was deliberately abandoned and burned by its own inhabitants, possibly in a final act of denial. If we can't have it, no one will. Others think rival factions within the empire fought over the capital as central authority disintegrated. The Hittite royal archives, thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting treaties, letters, laws, and religious texts, were left behind in the ruins. Nobody came back for them. Then Ugarit. This is the case that gives us the most visceral sense of what the end felt like for the people living through it. Ugarit was a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast, a node in the trade network, connected to everyone. Its archives contain letters in multiple languages: Akkadian, Hurrian, Ugaritic, Hittite, Egyptian. In its final days, the correspondence takes on a desperate tone. One letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, which is probably Cyprus, contains a passage that has become one of the most quoted texts in ancient Near Eastern studies. The king writes, and I'm paraphrasing from the original, that enemy ships have been spotted at sea. His own forces, he explains, are far away, stationed in Hittite territory. The city is undefended. He begs for help. My cities were burned, he writes, and they did evil things in my country. That letter was found in a kiln. It was never sent. Whoever was baking the clay tablet to harden it for sending never finished the job. The city was destroyed before the letter could leave. The kiln preserved it, baked but undelivered, for more than 3,000 years. After Ugarit, the destruction moves south and inland. Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, major cities in the Levant, show destruction layers from this period, though the specific agents of destruction are debated at each site. Some were burned. Some were simply abandoned as economic conditions deteriorated and the trade that sustained them evaporated. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces fall in a sequence over several decades. Pylos, on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, burned around 1180 BC. Its archive of Linear B tablets, administrative records tracking oil, wool, grain, and bronze distribution, was accidentally preserved by the fire that destroyed the palace. The tablets record a society in crisis. They mention coastal watchers being stationed at various points along the coast, as if an attack from the sea was expected. Bronze is being collected from temples for remelting, a sign of desperation, since bronze was precious and temple furnishings were sacred. Whatever they feared, it came. Mycenae itself, the citadel that gave the civilization its name, survived longer but was eventually abandoned by around 1100 BC. Tiryns, nearby, continued as a reduced settlement for some time after that. The great palace complexes, with their frescoed walls and their vast storage magazines, were gone, but people remained in the region, living more simply, in smaller communities, without the elaborate administrative apparatus that had characterized the palatial era. And this is one of the key insights from the Bronze Age story. In an interconnected system, you can't isolate cause from effect. The drought stresses the agriculture. The agricultural failure weakens the state. The weakened state can't maintain its military or its trade relationships. The breakdown of trade disrupts the supply of critical materials like tin. Without tin, you can't make bronze weapons and tools. Without weapons and tools, you can't defend your borders or maintain your economy. Meanwhile, the people displaced by all of these cascading failures start moving, which creates new pressures on the societies they move toward. It's a feedback loop. Every failure makes every other failure worse. And here's where the story gets really relevant for our purposes tonight. When the dust settled, when the Hittite Empire had fragmented into a dozen small successor states, when the Mycenaean palaces had burned, when Ugarit had been sacked and never rebuilt, when the international trade network had collapsed, what actually happened to the people? They didn't disappear. The Mycenaean Greeks entered a period that later historians, with characteristic drama, called the Greek Dark Ages. It lasted roughly 3 centuries, from about 1100 to 800 BC. During this time, palatial administration disappeared. The elaborate Linear B writing system, used by the palace bureaucracies to track inventories and taxation, fell out of use. Nobody needed it anymore because there were no palaces to administrate. Long-distance trade contracted dramatically. Population declined in some areas, though the extent is debated. Monumental constructions ceased, but the people were still there. They were still farming, still raising families, still burying their dead with whatever rituals they maintained, still telling stories. And some of those stories survived, passed down orally through generations, eventually finding their way into the works of Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey preserve memories of the Mycenaean world, its warrior kings, its great palaces, its siege of Troy, filtered through centuries of oral retelling. The Greeks didn't forget their Bronze Age past. They carried it forward as poetry. And within a few centuries, out of that supposed darkness, the Greeks re-emerged as one of the most creative and influential civilizations in human history. The classical Greeks. The Greeks of the polis, of democracy, of philosophy, of drama. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Pericles, the Parthenon. The so-called Dark Age wasn't an abyss, it was a cocoon. Something was transforming inside it. And some of those transformations were arguably improvements. Without the palace system's monopoly on bronze production, individual craftsmen experimented with iron, a metal that was harder to work, but whose ore was far more widely available. The palace system had concentrated wealth, power, and knowledge in the hands of a small elite. Its disappearance, while disruptive, also democratized access to resources and skills. The alphabetic writing system that emerged from Phoenicia was vastly simpler than the cuneiform and Linear B scripts it replaced. You could learn it in weeks rather than years. Literacy was no longer the exclusive province of palace scribes. Anyone could write. And that opened doors that the Bronze Age system had kept firmly shut. Meanwhile, on the island of Cyprus, the copper industry, which had been one of the pillars of the Bronze Age trade network, continued to function, albeit at reduced scale and with different trading partners. The Cypriots adapted. They shifted from the old palatial trade system to a more decentralized, merchant-driven model that would eventually feed into the Phoenician network. The knowledge of copper smelting, which had been developed over centuries, wasn't lost. It was carried forward by craftsmen who continued to practice their trade regardless of which kings or empires were in charge. Similarly, the Philistines, those former sea peoples, the Peleset, settled along the southern Levantine coast and built prosperous cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Ashdod. Their material culture shows a fascinating blend of Aegean and Levantine elements, exactly what you'd expect from displaced migrants adapting to a new environment while retaining pieces of their old one. The Phoenicians, operating out of cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos that had survived the upheaval in battered but functional form, moved into the trade vacuum left by the collapse. Freed from the constraints of the old palatial system, they became the greatest merchants and navigators of the ancient world. They sailed across the entire Mediterranean, founded colonies as far west as Spain and North Africa. Carthage, Rome's great rival, was a Phoenician colony. And the Phoenicians invented, or at the very least perfected and disseminated, the alphabet, the actual alphabet. The writing system based on individual consonant sounds that, through Greek and Latin adaptations, became the one you're using right now to process these words. That came out of the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. So, what collapsed? The palace system collapsed. The centralized, hierarchical political structures that had coordinated trade, collected taxes, maintained armies, and managed international relations, those fell apart. The diplomatic network collapsed. The Amarna-style system of royal correspondence and gift exchange, that ended. The specific material culture of the late Bronze Age, the distinctive pottery styles, the international architectural conventions, the standardized weight systems, those changed dramatically. But the people, the underlying populations, the technologies, the languages, the agricultural practices, the metallurgical knowledge, the navigational expertise, all of that survived. It reorganized. It simplified in some ways and innovated in others. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal, a significant improvement since iron ore is far more widely available than the tin and copper needed for bronze. The alphabet replaced the cumbersome cuneiform and hieroglyphic scripts, a far more accessible writing system that didn't require years of specialized training to learn. The system died. The people didn't. And the gap between those two facts, between the death of the system and the survival of the people, is where the real story lives. But the Bronze Age world, for all its interconnection, was still concentrated along a relatively narrow corridor of coastline. What happens when the same pattern plays out deep in a tropical jungle, in a civilization so vast and so sophisticated that it still defines our image of the ancient Americas? What happens when the people who are supposed to have mysteriously disappeared turn out to be very much present, not in the distant past, but right now, living in the shadow of their own ruins, speaking languages that are older than the English language by more than 1,000 years? The Yucatan Peninsula, southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, western Honduras. Dense, tropical forest, limestone bedrock, and almost no surface rivers. The water here goes underground, percolating through the porous limestone into vast subterranean systems, emerging at cenotes, sinkholes where the cave roof has collapsed, exposing pools of clear water far below the surface. The Maya considered cenotes sacred, portals to Xibalba, the underworld. They threw offerings into them, sometimes jade, sometimes pottery, sometimes people. It's not an obviously promising place to build a civilization. The soils are thin over limestone. The rainfall is seasonal and unpredictable. There's no great river like the Nile or the Euphrates to provide reliable irrigation. And yet, Between roughly 250 AD and 900 AD, this landscape supported one of the most extraordinary societies in human history, the classic Maya. And extraordinary doesn't begin to cover it. At its peak, the Maya world contained dozens of independent city-states, each centered on a monumental core of stone pyramids, palaces, plazas, and ball courts. Tikal, in the lowlands of Guatemala's Petén region, had a population of perhaps 60,000 people in its urban core, with tens of thousands more in outlying settlements. Its temple pyramids rose 200 feet above the forest canopy. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, 80 miles to the north, was comparable in size. Palenque, tucked into the foothills of the mountains in Chiapas, produced some of the most exquisite art and architecture in the ancient Americas. Copan, at the southern edge of the Maya world in modern Honduras, was a center of astronomical observation and sculptural artistry. Each of these cities was ruled by a Kuhul Ajar, a holy lord, who claimed divine ancestry and traced his lineage through elaborately carved genealogical texts on stone monuments called stelae. These weren't just kings, they were, in their own understanding, the pivot between the human world and the divine. They performed bloodletting rituals, piercing their tongues, earlobes, and other body parts with stingray spines and obsidian blades that were understood to open channels of communication with the gods and ancestors. The blood was dripped onto bark paper, which was then burned, and the smoke was believed to carry the offering upward. The king's blood fed the cosmos. Without it, the rains wouldn't come, the crops wouldn't grow, the cosmic order would unravel. And the agriculture that supported all of this was far more sophisticated than the term slash and burn, which was long applied to Maya farming, would suggest. The Maya practiced a diverse array of agricultural techniques, adapted to different microenvironments within the lowlands. In wetland areas called bajos, which flood seasonally, they built raised fields, rectangular platforms of earth and mud, elevated above the waterline, with canals between them for drainage and water storage. These raised fields could produce 2 or even 3 crops per year in areas that would otherwise have been agriculturally useless. On hillsides, they built stone terraces to prevent erosion and retain soil moisture. In household gardens, they cultivated an enormous variety of plants, not just corn, beans, and squash, but avocados, papayas, cacao, chili peppers, cotton, tobacco, and dozens of medicinal and ritual plants. They also managed the forest itself. Recent research using paleobotanical evidence and analysis of soil chemistry has suggested that what looks like natural forest around Maya sites may actually be a managed landscape, a kind of ancient agroforestry in which useful tree species were selectively encouraged and non-useful ones removed over centuries. The breadnut tree, for instance, which produces a highly nutritious nut, is found in unusually high concentrations around Maya archaeological sites. Some researchers believe the Maya essentially gardened the forest, shaping its composition to serve their needs while maintaining its structure and ecological functions. The distinction between farmland and forest that we take for granted may not have existed in Maya land management. And at its peak, the population of the Maya lowlands may have been remarkably large. LiDAR surveys conducted in 2018 over the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala, led by a team including Marcelo Canuto and Francisco Estrada Belli, revealed a landscape far more densely settled than anyone had expected. Beneath the jungle canopy, the LiDAR detected tens of thousands of previously unknown structures, houses, terraces, roads, defensive walls, quarries, and agricultural features, suggesting that the lowland population during the late Classic period may have been 2 to 3 times higher than earlier estimates. Some researchers now put the total Maya lowland population at 10 million or more. The landscape wasn't a collection of cities surrounded by empty jungle. It was a continuous, managed, densely inhabited terrain, what some archaeologists have started calling a garden city model, where the distinction between urban and rural, between cultivated and wild, was far less sharp than we tend to assume. The forest itself was partly a human creation, shaped by centuries of selective planting, burning, and management. And the roads and causeways revealed by LiDAR, raised limestone pathways called sakbiob, some of them stretching for dozens of kilometers, connected communities across the landscape in a web of physical and social infrastructure far more extensive than anyone had imagined. When that system underwent its transformation in the 9th century, what was lost wasn't just a few cities. It was a whole landscape of interconnected communities, a web of roads and canals and raised fields and managed forests that had taken centuries to build. But the people who had built it, and who knew how the pieces fit together, carried that knowledge with them. The farming techniques survived, the forest management survived, the knowledge of plants and soils and seasons survived. What didn't survive was the political superstructure that had coordinated the whole system at its highest level of complexity. The Maya had writing, and this matters enormously because it means we can hear their voices, at least partially. They developed the only fully realized writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a complex script combining logographic and syllabic elements carved on stone, painted on pottery and murals, and written in bark paper books called codices. For a long time, scholars couldn't read it. The Spanish, when they arrived in the 16th century, had burned almost all the codices. The bishop Diego de Landa organized a particularly notorious auto da fe at Mani in 1562, destroying an unknown number of books. Only 4 Maya codices survive today. But the stone inscriptions remained, and beginning in the 1950s, scholars like Yuri Knorosov, a Russian linguist working from photographs in Leningrad, far from any Maya ruin, began to crack the code. Knorosov showed that the Maya script was partly phonetic, that individual signs could represent syllables, and that the texts could be read as language. This was a breakthrough. Over the following decades, researchers including David Stewart, who began making major contributions while still a teenager, Linda Sheila, and many others steadily expanded the decipherment. Today, we can read perhaps 80 to 90% of classic Maya inscriptions. And what those texts reveal is a world of intense political competition. The Maya lowlands were not united under a single empire. They were a constellation of competing city-states, locked in shifting alliances and rivalries that lasted centuries. Tikal and Calakmul were the 2 greatest rivals, and the wars between them and their respective allies drove much of the political history of the classic period. Kings captured rival kings and sacrificed them in elaborate public rituals. Wars were fought for prestige, for captives, and for the right to claim dominance in a network of tribute and alliance that functioned something like a deadly game of chess played across centuries. They also had mathematics. They used a vigesimal system, base 20, and they independently invented the concept of zero, one of only a handful of civilizations in history to do so. Their calendar systems were extraordinarily precise. They tracked the cycles of Venus with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for many centuries. They calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the modern value. And they used these calculations for political and ceremonial purposes, timing their wars, their building dedications, and their ritual bloodlettings to align with cosmic events. This was not a primitive society by any measure. By the standards of any era, the classic Maya were one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. And then, over a period of roughly 150 years, from about 750 AD to 900 AD, most of the major cities in the southern Maya lowlands were abandoned. Construction stopped. The last dated stela at Tikal was carved in 869 AD. The last one at Calakmul around 810. At Copan, the last monument dates to 822. One by one, across the southern lowlands, the tradition of carving dated monuments, the very tradition that allows us to track the political history of the classic period, simply ceased. The elaborate political system of divine kings and competing courts unraveled. The population of the southern lowlands dropped significantly, though the precise numbers are still debated. The jungle moved in. For more than a century, this was treated as one of archaeology's great mysteries. What could possibly have caused such a powerful civilization to simply vanish? The answers proposed over the years form a catalogue of catastrophe. Drought, warfare, deforestation, soil exhaustion, disease, peasant revolt, foreign invasion, ecological overshoot. Each theory had its advocates, and each could point to supporting evidence. But what the last few decades of research have shown is that no single factor explains what happened. The story is one of convergence. Start with climate. In 2012, a team led by Martin Medina Elizalde and Elko Rowling published a study based on an analysis of a stalagmite from a cave in southern Belize. Stalagmites grow slowly, layer by layer, and the oxygen isotope composition of each layer reflects the rainfall conditions when it was deposited. What they found was a series of severe and prolonged droughts hitting the Maya lowlands between about 800 and 1100 AD. The timing overlaps precisely with the period of urban abandonment. Other studies, using lake sediment cores from lakes in the Petén region, particularly Lake Chichancanab, confirmed and refined the picture. The southern Maya lowlands experienced some of the driest conditions in 7,000 years, during exactly the window when cities were being emptied. The stalagmite data has been corroborated by other proxy records. A study of sediment from Lake Chichancanab on the Yucatan Peninsula, published by Nicholas Evans and colleagues, used gypsum deposits in the lake bed to estimate past rainfall. Gypsum precipitates when lake water evaporates, so layers rich in gypsum indicate dry periods. The results were striking. The driest period in the entire record, spanning more than 2,000 years, fell between about 800 and 1000 AD. A separate study using leaf wax isotopes from sediment cores in the same region estimated that rainfall during the worst droughts may have decreased by as much as 40 to 50% compared to modern averages. For a population of millions dependent on rain-fed agriculture and seasonal water storage, that kind of reduction was devastating. The Maya were not unfamiliar with drought. They had lived in this environment for more than a millennium and had developed sophisticated water management. Tikal, for example, had a system of reservoirs that collected rainwater and stored it for the dry season. Other cities built check dams, canals, and raised field systems in seasonal wetlands called bajos. These were impressive engineering achievements, but they had limits. And those limits became critical when the droughts of the 9th century turned out to be not just severe, but prolonged, lasting decades, not just years. And here Tainter's framework clicks into place. Over the centuries of the classic period, the Maya had invested heavily in intensifying their agriculture and managing their environment. They terraced hillsides, drained wetlands, built raised fields, and cleared forest for cultivation. Each new agricultural project was a response to the demands of a growing population and the requirements of an increasingly complex political system that needed surplus production to feed the cities, the armies, the priesthoods, and the building crews. Each additional project yielded diminishing returns. The best land was developed first. Later development pushed into more marginal areas. More labor was needed for each additional unit of production. When the droughts hit, they didn't just reduce water availability, they stressed the entire agricultural system. Crop yields fell, food reserves dwindled, and the population, which had grown to levels that assumed continued access to full water reserves and full agricultural production, was now too large for the reduced carrying capacity of the land. The cities, which were net consumers of food, drawing in agricultural surplus from the countryside, became increasingly difficult to sustain. And the wars got worse. Inscriptions from the late Classic period document escalating conflict. Wars that had once been relatively contained affairs, fought between rival kings for prestige and high-status captives, became broader and more destructive. The frequency of warfare monuments increases in the 8th century. Some archaeologists see evidence of what they call total war, attacks aimed not just at capturing enemy kings, but at destroying rival cities' productive capacity. When resources shrink, the competition for what remains intensifies, and behind the political and military crisis lay an ideological one. The Kuhul Ajar derived his authority from his perceived ability to mediate between the human and divine worlds. His rituals were supposed to bring rain, ensure harvests, maintain cosmic order. When the rains stopped coming, when the harvests failed despite the rituals, when the wars brought destruction rather than the captives and glory that were supposed to validate royal power, the entire ideological framework that justified the system came under pressure. The contract between ruler and ruled, implicit, never written down, but absolutely fundamental, began to break. We can see traces of this breakdown in the archaeological record. At some sites, monuments were defaced, royal portraits were damaged, and the inscriptions that proclaimed royal genealogies and divine connections were deliberately chipped away. Someone was angry at the kings. Someone had concluded that the system wasn't working anymore. The bargain that held the system together, we give you our labor, our crops, our blood, and you give us cosmic security, was breaking down. If the king can't deliver rain, why are we building his temple? People left. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic exodus, but gradually, over decades. Some moved north, to the cities of the Puc region in northern Yucatan, where sites like Uxmal, Cabar, and Sayil were actually flourishing during the same period when southern cities were declining. Some moved to the coast, where marine resources provided a buffer against agricultural failure. Some simply dissolved into smaller communities in the countryside, farming villages where life was harder in some ways, but where the demands of the elite system no longer applied. And here is the fact that changes everything about this story. Today, there are an estimated 6 million Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak roughly 30 different Mayan languages. Some of these communities practice traditions that archaeologists can trace directly to the Classic period. The Chachak rain ceremony, performed by some Yucatec Maya communities to this day, shows recognizable parallels to rituals depicted on Classic period pottery and monumental sculpture. Milpa agriculture, the intercropping of corn, beans, and squash, has been practiced continuously for thousands of years. The backstrap loom, the nixtamalization of corn, the use of specific medicinal plants. These are living traditions, not museum displays. There's one more piece of the Maya story that's worth dwelling on, because it shows just how misleading the word collapse can be, even within the context of Maya civilization itself. While the southern lowland cities were being abandoned in the 9th century, the northern Yucatan was experiencing something very different. Chichen Itza, located in the dry scrublands of northern Yucatan, rose to become the dominant power in the region during exactly the period when Tikal and Calakmul were declining. Its architecture shows a blend of Maya and Central Mexican influences. The famous pyramid of Kukulkan, the great ball court, the temple of the warriors with its rows of carved columns. The site attracted people, trade, and political power precisely as the southern centers lost them. It's as if the center of gravity of Maya civilization shifted northward, pulled by the failure of the south and the opportunities of the north. After Chichen Itza's own decline in the 11th century, power shifted again to Mayapan, a walled city that served as the political capital of the northern Yucatan for roughly 2 centuries. Mayapan was smaller and less architecturally impressive than Chichen Itza, but it was politically active, managing a confederation of noble lineages through a council-based system rather than the divine kingship of the classic period. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they found the Yucatan divided among competing Maya states, each with its own ruling lineage, its own territory, its own traditions. These were not the survivors of a collapse, they were the inheritors of a transformed political landscape. And on the coast, the situation was even more dynamic. Cities like Tulum, perched on limestone cliffs above the turquoise Caribbean, served as thriving trading ports in the 15th and 16th centuries. Tulum's murals, still visible on the walls of its small temples, depict gods and rituals that connect directly to classic period traditions. The architecture is modest compared to Tikal, but the cultural continuity is unmistakable. When the Spanish first sailed past Tulum, they described it as a city as large as Seville, which was certainly an exaggeration, but the fact that it could be compared to a major European city at all tells you something about the state of Maya civilization 5 centuries after the supposed collapse. And then there's the matter of the Maya codices, the bark paper books that the Spanish burned. We have 4 survivors: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. They contain astronomical tables, ritual calendars, prophecies, and divination almanacs. They were created in the post-classic period, centuries after the collapse, demonstrating that the intellectual traditions of Maya civilization, the mathematical sophistication, the astronomical observation, the calendrical expertise, had been continuously maintained and developed across the supposed catastrophic break. 6 million people. Languages unbroken. Agriculture continuous. Intellectual traditions maintained across 1,000 years of political transformation. And we call it a collapse. The classic Maya political system of the southern lowlands, the specific arrangement of competing divine kings, monumental stone cities, and long-distance political networks, that system ended. The cities were abandoned. The stelae stopped being carved. The institution of the Kuhul Ajau faded from the southern lowlands. Those specific, historically contingent arrangements of power and culture are gone. But Maya civilization, understood not as a specific political arrangement but as a living cultural tradition carried by millions of people, never ended. Maya people? Maya languages? Maya agriculture? Maya ritual? Maya identity? Never interrupted, never broken. Stretched, transformed, adapted, evolved, but never broken. The Maya story is the clearest illustration of the distinction at the heart of everything we're exploring tonight. The system died, the people didn't. And the persistent use of the word collapse to describe what happened obscures the survival, privileges the ruins over the living descendants, and turns a complex story of adaptation into a simple narrative of extinction. But 5,000 miles east of the Yucatan, in the tropical forests of mainland Southeast Asia, another civilization built something even larger. A city so vast that its full extent wasn't understood until satellite technology revealed it in the 21st century. And when that city was left behind, the same pattern played out. The people didn't vanish. They just went somewhere more practical. Angkor. The word itself comes from the Sanskrit Nagara, meaning city. For roughly 6 centuries, from the 9th century to the 15th, it was the capital of the Khmer Empire, which at its height controlled most of mainland Southeast Asia, modern Cambodia, large parts of Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Its kings built temples of such scale and beauty that when the French naturalist Henri Mouhot encountered Angkor Wat in 1860, he wrote, genuinely stunned, that it was grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. But Mouhot was seeing only a fraction of what was there. For the next century and a half, Angkor was understood primarily through its temples, the magnificent stone complexes that rose above the forest. It wasn't until 2012, when an international team used airborne LiDAR to scan the landscape around Angkor, penetrating the forest canopy with laser pulses and mapping the ground surface beneath, that the full scale of the city was revealed. What they found was staggering. Greater Angkor covered an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers, about 400 square miles. The LiDAR revealed a vast, organized urban landscape stretching far beyond the temple cores. A grid of roads, residential areas, water channels, ponds, rice paddies, and infrastructure that had been completely invisible from the ground. Population estimates for Greater Angkor at its peak range from 750,000 to over 1 million people. For perspective, London in the year 1300, roughly the same period as Angkor's zenith, had a population of about 80,000. Paris was perhaps 200,000. Angkor may have been the largest city on Earth. The LiDAR discovery deserves a moment of its own, because it changed everything we thought we knew about Angkor. Before 2012, Angkor was understood as a collection of temples, remarkable temples certainly, but temples set in what appeared to be empty forest. The assumption was that the city's population had been concentrated around the temple cores, and that the surrounding jungle was, well, jungle. The LiDAR survey shattered that assumption in a single flight season. Damien Evans, who led the analysis, described the moment the data was processed as transformative. Where the ground-level view showed unbroken forest, the laser-stripped elevation model revealed a dense urban grid. Streets, canals, house mounds, rice field boundaries, and water management features stretching in every direction. The city didn't end at the temple walls. It extended for dozens of kilometers in every direction, a low-density urban sprawl that anticipated modern suburban patterns by nearly a millennium. Subsequent LiDAR campaigns revealed even more. In 2015, a larger survey identified previously unknown cities beneath the jungle canopy. Entire urban centers that had never been documented, connected to Angkor by roads and waterways. The picture that emerged was of a vast, integrated metropolitan landscape, with Angkor's temples at its ceremonial center and a web of satellite communities, agricultural zones, and infrastructure spreading outward across the Cambodian plain. And the engine that drove it all was water. The Khmer Empire was a hydraulic civilization in the most literal sense. The entire urban landscape of Angkor was organized around the management of water. The centerpiece was the Barre system, enormous rectangular reservoirs artificially constructed that captured monsoon rainfall and stored it for use during the dry season. The West Barre, the largest, measures 8 kilometers long by 2.5 kilometers wide and held an estimated 53 million cubic meters of water. The East Barre, slightly smaller, served a similar purpose. These weren't natural lakes. They were engineering projects on a scale that has few parallels in the pre-industrial world. The engineering required to build the barrays alone is staggering. The West Barre was constructed by building massive earthen embankments, some of them more than 20 feet high, around the perimeter of the reservoir, and then allowing monsoon rains to fill the enclosed area. The embankments were constructed of compacted laterite and earth, with their slopes carefully graded to prevent erosion. The reservoir's dimensions are precise. The sides are almost perfectly straight, the corners almost perfectly right-angled, even though the terrain it sits on is not perfectly flat. Whoever designed it had surveying skills of a high order. And the barrays weren't just passive storage pools, they were connected to a distribution network of remarkable intricacy. From the barrays, water was distributed through an intricate network of canals, channels, and sluice gates that fed rice paddies across the Greater Angkor landscape. The system allowed multiple rice harvests per year, producing the enormous food surplus that supported the city's vast population and the monumental construction projects of its kings. The relationship was circular. The water system enabled the rice production fed the population maintained the water system and built the temples. Remove any element, and the whole thing was in trouble. And the temples themselves, hundreds of them, built over 6 centuries by successive kings, each trying to outdo his predecessors, represented an enormous ongoing investment of labor, materials, and resources. Angkor Wat alone is estimated to have required the quarrying, transport, and placement of between 5 and 10 million blocks of sandstone, each weighing an average of 1.5 tons, brought from quarries more than 50 kilometers away. Building it took roughly 37 years, and Angkor Wat was just one of many such projects. Jayavarman VII, who ruled from about 1181 to 1218, was perhaps the most ambitious builder of all, constructing the Bayon Temple with its famous towers of smiling stone faces, the Priya Khan Temple Complex, Tar Prom, and an extensive network of roads, hospitals, and rest houses across the empire. Jayavarman VII also shifted the state religion from Hinduism to Mahayana Buddhism, a profound transformation that would shape Cambodian culture permanently. The smiling faces of the Bayon are often interpreted as representations of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of compassion, but they also bear a resemblance to Jayavarman VII himself. The boundary between king and god in Khmer political theology was deliberately blurred. For centuries, the system worked. The reservoirs filled, the rice grew, the temples rose, the empire expanded. Angkor was the center of a world that radiated outward through trade connections to China, India, and the maritime states of Southeast Asia. But the water system that made Angkor magnificent also made it fragile. Research by the Greater Angkor Project, led by scholars including Roland Fletcher, Damien Evans, and Christophe Potier, has revealed that by the 14th century, the hydraulic infrastructure was under severe strain. Centuries of use had caused channels to silt up. The canals required constant dredging and maintenance. Some parts of the system showed evidence of ad hoc repairs, patches and redirections that suggest the original design was no longer functioning as intended. The whole apparatus had been calibrated for a specific pattern of monsoon rainfall, enough to fill the reservoirs, but not so much that the system flooded. And the climate stopped cooperating. Dendrochronological data, tree ring records from mainland Southeast Asia, analyzed by Brendan Buckley and colleagues, document prolonged droughts in the 1340s and 1350s, followed by periods of unusually intense monsoon rainfall in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Mega droughts followed by mega monsoons. The droughts left the reservoirs depleted. The mega monsoons overwhelmed the canal system, causing erosion, breaching embankments, flooding areas that weren't designed to be flooded, and damaging the very infrastructure that was supposed to manage the water. The system had been designed for average conditions, and the 14th century stubbornly refused to deliver average conditions. Buckley's tree ring analysis, published in 2010, found that the drought of the mid-14th century was the most severe in the 600-year record, drier than anything Angkor had experienced during its entire existence as a capital. And the monsoon surges that followed weren't just heavy rains. They were powerful enough to breach embankments in the water management system, as evidenced by erosion patterns and damage to canal infrastructure visible in the LiDAR data. The barrays that had been the lifeblood of Angkor were alternately running dry and being overwhelmed. The worst possible combination for a system designed around steady, predictable water management. Simultaneously, a military threat was growing. The Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, founded in 1351, began expanding aggressively into Khmer territory. Angkor was sacked by Ayutthayan forces multiple times, most significantly in 1431. But Angkor had already been weakening for decades before the Thai attacks. The military pressure was a blow to a system already compromised by infrastructure failure and environmental stress. And so the Khmer made a decision that, from the outside, from the perspective of 19th century European explorers who discovered Angkor covered in jungle, looked like a catastrophe, but from the inside was probably something closer to strategic realism. They moved the capital. The center of Khmer political power shifted south and east, first to Lovek and Udong, and eventually to Phnom Penh, located at the confluence of the Mekong, the Tonle Sap, and the Bassac rivers. This was, by almost any practical measure, a better location. It had direct river access to the sea, facilitating maritime trade with China and the Malay world. It was near the Tonle Sap Great Lake, which provided enormous quantities of fish, the most important protein source in Cambodian cuisine to this day. It didn't require a massive, maintenance-intensive hydraulic infrastructure to sustain its population. The move from Angkor to Phnom Penh was a move from a landlocked hydraulic capital to a riverine commercial one. It made sense. And here's a detail that doesn't get mentioned enough in the standard narrative of Angkor's fall. The decision to move the capital wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a process, played out over decades. The Khmer court seems to have maintained a presence at Angkor intermittently, even after the center of political gravity had shifted south. King Ang Chan I briefly reoccupied Angkor in the 16th century and carried out restoration work at Angkor Wat. The temples were never entirely abandoned. Buddhist monks lived at Angkor Wat continuously, maintaining the site as a functioning religious center. When Portuguese and Spanish visitors reached Angkor in the 16th century, they found people living there and worshipping at the temples. The abandonment of Angkor was always partial, always gradual, and always more complicated than the dramatic narrative suggests. The move to the Phnom Penh area also wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic repositioning. The Khmer were adapting to a changing economic environment. The 14th and 15th centuries saw the rise of maritime trade across Southeast Asia, driven by Chinese demand for spices, aromatic woods, and other tropical products. A capital at the junction of major rivers with easy access to the Mekong Delta and the sea was far better positioned to participate in this new economy than a landlocked capital dependent on an aging hydraulic system. The move from Angkor to Phnom Penh mirrors, in some ways, the shift from Chaco Canyon to the Rio Grande, a move from a location optimized for one set of conditions to a location better suited to a new reality. The Khmer people didn't disappear. They are the modern Cambodians. The Khmer language is spoken by roughly 16 million people today. Theravada Buddhism, which had been gradually replacing the older Hindu Mahayana Buddhist traditions since the 13th century, became and remains the dominant religion of Cambodia. The continuity is direct and unbroken, and Angkor itself was never entirely forgotten. Buddhist monks continued to maintain parts of the temple complex, particularly Angkor Wat, which transitioned smoothly from a Hindu temple to a Buddhist one. Cambodian kings periodically visited Angkor. It remained a pilgrimage site, a place of spiritual significance, a part of the living Khmer cultural landscape. When Muho discovered it, he was discovering something that the Khmer had never lost. The discovery was a European event, shaped by European assumptions about lost civilizations and mysterious ruins. The Cambodians didn't need to discover Angkor. They knew where it was. Angkor's story mirrors the Maya story in its essentials, but with its own specific texture. A massive, sophisticated, resource-intensive system that became unsustainable in the face of environmental change, military pressure, and the sheer cost of maintaining its own complexity. The people who built it made a pragmatic choice to relocate to a place that better served their needs. The system died. The people walked away and built something new. But what about a civilization whose ending is genuinely mysterious? Not because the people vanished, but because we can't even read their writing. A civilization whose cities are among the most carefully planned in the ancient world, yet whose political system remains almost entirely unknown. A civilization that, in its quiet way, may challenge our assumptions about what a complex society needs to look like. The Indus Valley, modern Pakistan and northwestern India. And here, roughly 4,500 years ago, something appeared that refuses to fit the usual template of ancient civilizations. Most of the great ancient civilizations were organized around visible, dramatic concentrations of power. Egypt had its pharaohs and pyramids. Mesopotamia had its ziggurats and kings. China had its emperors and bronze ritual vessels. The Maya had their kuhul ajars and their carved stelae proclaiming royal glory. Power announced itself, loudly, in stone and gold and blood. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization after Harappa, the first major site excavated, did things differently. Their cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, Lothal, Kalibangan, and hundreds of smaller settlements spread across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, were meticulously planned. Streets were laid out in precise grids, oriented to the cardinal directions. Houses were built from standardized bricks whose proportions, a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4, length to width to height, were consistent across sites separated by hundreds of miles. This kind of standardization implies coordination, authority, planning. But whose authority? We don't know. The cities had drainage systems that channeled wastewater from individual homes through covered terracotta pipes into main sewers running beneath the streets. Mohenjo-Daro's Great Bath, a large, waterproofed rectangular pool, roughly 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and nearly 2.5 meters deep, with steps leading down on 2 sides and a series of small rooms surrounding it, is one of the most enigmatic structures in the ancient world. It was waterproofed with a layer of natural bitumen between 2 courses of bricks, showing a sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. Clean water was fed in from a well, and used water was drained through a corbelled drain. The care taken with its construction suggests that water had a significance beyond the purely practical. Perhaps ritual purification, perhaps social gathering, perhaps something we don't have a category for. It is often interpreted as having served a ritual or ceremonial purpose. Granaries suggest centralized food storage. Dockyard structures at Lothal suggest organized maritime trade. The evidence points to a well-organized, centrally coordinated society. But here's what makes the Indus civilization so unusual. There are no obvious palaces, no monumental royal tombs stuffed with treasure, no statues depicting kings trampling their enemies, no carved inscriptions boasting about military conquests. The largest buildings appear to be communal or functional, baths, granaries, meeting halls, rather than personal aggrandizements of individual rulers. If there were kings, they didn't advertise the way kings in Egypt and Mesopotamia did. If there was a ruling elite, they expressed their power through infrastructure and standardization rather than through monumental self-glorification. And then there's the sheer geographic scale. The Indus civilization covered roughly 1.3 million square kilometers, an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. More than 1,000 settlements have been identified, from large cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each with populations of perhaps 30 to 40,000 people, to small farming villages and seasonal camps. The consistency of material culture across this vast area, the same brick proportions, similar pottery styles, comparable weights and measures, the same types of seals, suggests some form of coordinating authority, but its nature remains elusive. Dholavira, in the Rann of Kutch in western India, adds another layer to the puzzle. This site features an enormous stone inscription. Carved Indus signs displayed on what appears to have been a public signboard above one of the city's gates. If we could read it, we might know the city's name, or its patron deity, or a royal proclamation. But we can't. The signs stare at us across 45 centuries, perfectly legible in form, completely opaque in meaning. Lothal, in Gujarat, shows evidence of a possible dockyard, a large rectangular basin connected to a river channel, which some archaeologists interpret as a harbour facility for maritime trade. If that interpretation is correct, Lothal was a port city engaged in commerce with Mesopotamia, Oman, and possibly the coast of East Africa. The Indus people were maritime traders, navigating the Arabian Sea in vessels that have left no physical trace, but whose existence is implied by the distribution of Indus-style artifacts across a vast coastal network. The Indus people had a writing system. We've recovered thousands of inscribed seals, small square stones with carved images, often of animals, and short strings of symbols along the top. But despite more than a century of attempts by linguists, cryptographers, and now computer scientists, the Indus script remains undeciphered. The inscriptions are too short, most are only 4 or 5 signs long, to provide enough context for reliable decipherment. We have the script, we cannot read it. And without the writing, a vast area of Indus life, their beliefs, their political organization, their history, their names for themselves, remains inaccessible. What we do know is that the Indus civilization was connected to the wider world. Indus seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites, and Mesopotamian cuneiform texts mention a place called Meluha that many scholars identify with the Indus region. Trade goods, carnelian beads, shell ornaments, Indus-style weights appear at sites along the Persian Gulf and in Mesopotamia. The port city of Lothal on the coast of modern Gujarat appears to have been a major center for maritime commerce. The Indus people were not isolated. They were active participants in a Bronze Age trading world, and then between about 1900 and 1700 BC, the urban phase of the Indus civilization ended. The great cities were gradually depopulated. At Mohenjo-Daro, the latest occupation levels show signs of deterioration. Buildings that were once well maintained fell into disrepair. The sophisticated drainage systems clogged and were no longer cleared. New construction was cruder, built with reused bricks, lacking the precision of earlier phases. The population thinned. Eventually the city stood empty. For decades, the dominant explanation was violent invasion. The Aryan invasion theory proposed that Indo-European-speaking peoples from Central Asia swept through the mountain passes into the Indus Valley, conquering the native population and imposing their own culture. This theory, formulated in the 19th century, carried overtones of racial hierarchy that were inseparable from the colonial context in which it was developed. And the archaeological evidence for a dramatic, violent conquest has never been strong. There are no widespread destruction layers, no mass graves filled with victims of military slaughter, no concentration of weapons suggesting a final stand. What the evidence does suggest is more gradual and, in its way, more interesting. Two interrelated processes seem to have driven the decline. First, the rivers changed. Many Indus settlements, particularly in the eastern part of the civilization's territory, were concentrated along the Gaga-Hakra river system. Geological evidence now suggests that this system was already in decline by the time the Indus cities were at their peak. The rivers were fed partly by monsoon rainfall and partly by glacial meltwater from the Himalayas, and changes in both precipitation patterns and tectonic activity appear to have reduced their flow over time. Some tributaries shifted their courses, others dried up entirely. For communities that depended on river water for agriculture, drinking and transportation, the progressive loss of their river system would have been catastrophic, not suddenly, but gradually, over generations. Second, the climate dried. The monsoon weakened. The same broad aridification trend that affected large parts of the Northern Hemisphere in the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC, what climatologists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, reduced rainfall across the Indian subcontinent. Less monsoon rainfall meant less river water, less groundwater recharge, less reliable agriculture. The urban system, which required surplus production to feed its non-farming population, became harder to sustain. And in response, the Indus people did what people do. They moved. The settlement pattern shifted eastward and southward, toward the upper Gangetic Plain and into Gujarat, where monsoon rainfall was more reliable and permanent rivers offered better long-term prospects. The elaborate urban infrastructure of the Indus heartland was left behind, not because it was destroyed, but because the environmental conditions that had made it viable no longer existed. The migration wasn't a single exodus. It was a process that unfolded over centuries. The late Harappan, or post-urban phase, lasting from roughly 1900 to 1300 BC, shows a gradual shift in settlement patterns. The large cities shrank and were eventually abandoned. But at the same time, the number of smaller settlements in the eastern regions, Punjab, Haryana, western Uttar Pradesh, actually increased. People were dispersing, moving from a few large urban centers to many smaller rural communities. The total population of the Indus cultural sphere may not have declined dramatically during this transition. What changed was how that population was distributed, from concentrated and urban to dispersed and rural. And some aspects of Indus technology and culture actually spread during this period. The distinctive Indus weight system, small, carefully calibrated stone cubes in a binary decimal sequence, appears at sites outside the traditional Indus heartland during the late and post-Harappan phases. Certain ceramic traditions that are characteristic of the Indus civilization have been found at sites in the upper Gangetic Plain. The people weren't just fleeing, they were settling, adapting, and bringing their knowledge with them. The cultural thread did not break. The transition from the late Harappan phase to the subsequent cultures of the Indian subcontinent is not a clean break, but a gradual transformation. Certain ceramic traditions, certain craft techniques, particularly bead making and metalworking, show continuity across the transition. Some scholars see echoes of Indus religious practices in later Hinduism, ritual bathing, reverence for certain animals, specific iconographic motifs. The connections are debated, and without deciphered texts, proving direct continuity is difficult. But the population didn't vanish. The people migrated, adapted, and contributed to the cultural foundations of what would become Indian civilization. There's one more detail about the Indus decline that deserves attention. At Mohenjo-Daro, the late occupation levels don't just show declining standards of construction. They show a city that had become overcrowded in some areas, while others were abandoned. Room partitions were added to subdivide previously spacious houses. Pottery kilns, which were once confined to designated areas outside residential zones, appear in the middle of living quarters. The careful zoning that characterized the city's peak, residential areas here, industrial areas there, public spaces carefully delineated, broke down. People were squeezing into spaces that hadn't been designed for them, while other parts of the city lay empty. It looks like the kind of disorganization you'd expect in a city whose coordinating authority has weakened or disappeared, where individual households are making do as best they can without anyone managing the overall system. And then, gradually, even those holdout inhabitants left. Some of the last artifacts found at Mohenjo-Daro include a handful of bodies, roughly 37 individuals found in various locations across the site, that were long cited as evidence of a violent massacre. But re-examination of the skeletons has shown that they died at different times, not in a single event. Some show signs of disease, not violence. They may simply be the last people who stayed, the ones who couldn't or wouldn't leave, dying one by one as the city emptied out around them. What we're left with is a story of gradual adaptation to changing conditions. A migration, not a mass death. The cities were built for a world with more water and more monsoon. When that world changed, the people changed with it. They simplified. They dispersed. They carried forward what they could and let go of what they couldn't sustain. And the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, with their empty streets and their silent drains, don't mark a gravesite. They mark a departure point, the first stop on a journey that continued long after the last family packed up and walked east toward a new beginning. But if the Indus people could migrate across hundreds of miles of open terrain, finding new rivers and new land, what happens when you live in a place where migration is harder, where the landscape imposes limits, where the nearest reliable water is days away across open desert, and the climate turns hostile not for years, but for decades? The American Southwest. Canyon country, red sandstone, impossible blue sky, and a dryness that gets into everything. Your skin, your throat, the wood of the buildings, the very mortar between the stones. For most people passing through, this looks like inhospitable terrain. Beautiful, certainly, in a stark and austere way, but hard to imagine building anything permanent here, let alone a civilization. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, a complex society not only survived here, but flourished. We call them the Ancestral Puebloans. That name replaced an older term, Anasazi, which comes from the Navajo language and can be translated as ancient enemies or ancestors of our enemies, depending on context. The modern Pueblo peoples, the Hopi of northeastern Arizona, the Zuni of western New Mexico, the Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande, are their direct descendants, and they prefer the newer term because it makes the relationship explicit. These aren't anonymous ancients. These are their grandparents. The most dramatic center of ancestral Puebloan civilization was Chaco Canyon, a shallow, arid canyon in the San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico. And Chaco is one of those places that, when you first encounter it, rearranges your assumptions about what was possible in pre-Columbian North America. Chaco Canyon contains structures called Great Houses. These are enormous, multi-story masonry buildings built of carefully shaped sandstone blocks set in courses with remarkable precision. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, contained more than 600 rooms, rose 4 stories in places, and covered more than 2 acres. It was the largest building in North America until a steel-framed apartment building in New York surpassed it in the 1880s. For roughly 800 years, a stone building in the New Mexico desert held that record. Pueblo Bonito wasn't alone. A dozen great houses stood within Chaco Canyon, and dozens more were scattered across the surrounding San Juan Basin at distances of up to 100 miles. These outlying great houses were connected to Chaco by a network of engineered roads, wide, straight, formally constructed, some of them more than 30 feet across, cut through the desert landscape with a directness that sometimes required ramps carved into cliff faces or stairways chiseled out of bedrock. The roads are wider than practical foot traffic would require, and they don't always follow the easiest routes. Some archaeologists believe they had ceremonial significance, processional routes connecting outlying communities to the spiritual center at Chaco. The Chacoans also embedded astronomical knowledge into their architecture. The Sun Dagger site at Fajada Butte, where a dagger-shaped sliver of sunlight passes through a carved spiral petroglyph at noon on the summer solstice, is one of the most precisely calibrated astronomical markers in the ancient Americas. Several buildings within Chaco appear to be aligned with lunar standstill events, the 18.6-year cycle of the moon's northernmost and southernmost rise points. Tracking this cycle requires sustained observation across nearly 2 decades. Someone was watching the sky very carefully for a very long time. And then there are the kivas, circular, semi-subterranean rooms, entered through a hole in the roof, with a fire pit at the center and a small hole in the floor called a sipapu, which in modern Pueblo tradition represents the portal through which the ancestors emerged from the underworld. The great houses at Chaco contain dozens of kivas, some of them enormous. Casa Rinconada, a great kiva standing alone near the center of the canyon floor, is more than 60 feet in diameter. Its 4 massive posts once supported a roof that would have covered an area large enough to hold hundreds of people. The acoustics inside a great kiva are remarkable. The curved walls reflect sound inward, amplifying and concentrating it. Speaking in a great kiva, your voice carries in ways that feel almost otherworldly. Some researchers believe these spaces were designed for their acoustic properties, to enhance the impact of ritual speech or music. The Chacoans also maintained what may have been a signaling network. Small masonry structures on prominent hilltops across the San Juan Basin, with clear lines of sight to Chaco Canyon and to each other, have been interpreted as signal stations, places where fire or reflected light could transmit messages across dozens of miles. If this interpretation is correct, the Chacoans could have communicated across their entire network in a matter of hours, coordinating the movement of people and goods with a speed that seems remarkable for a society without writing or wheeled transport. But Chaco Canyon has a fundamental problem, and it's the same problem it had 1,000 years ago. It's dry. Annual rainfall averages about 9 inches. There are no permanent streams. The water table is deep. Growing enough food to feed the population that built and used the great houses would have required either extremely efficient dryland farming, a reliable supply chain bringing food from elsewhere, or both. And the evidence suggests it was mainly the latter. Chemical apatulous corn cobs found at Chaco has shown that much of the corn consumed there was grown not in the canyon itself, but in outlying areas with better agricultural conditions, areas connected to Chaco by those very roads. In other words, Chaco was a center that drew resources from a periphery. The great houses may have functioned less as permanent residences for large populations and more as periodic gathering places, sites for ceremonies, redistribution of goods, and political meetings that brought people together from across a wide region. The turquoise found at Chaco in enormous quantities, more than 200,000 pieces at Pueblo Bonito alone, came from sources as far away as the Cerrillos mines, south of Santa Fe, 100 miles distant. Timber for roof beams was hauled from mountain forests 50 to 70 miles away. Macaw feathers, prized for ritual use, came from Mesoamerica, 1,000 miles to the south. And recent excavation has confirmed that the Chacoans actually kept live macaws in captivity, raising tropical birds in the high desert, far from their natural habitat. The discovery of macaw remains, macaw eggshell, and dedicated breeding rooms at Pueblo Bonito tells us that Chaco's connections to the south weren't limited to occasional trade missions. There was a sustained flow of exotic materials and possibly ideas and practices between the American Southwest and Mesoamerica. Chocolate residue has been found in ceramic vessels at Chaco. Cacao doesn't grow within 1,000 miles of the site. The Chacoans were drinking chocolate in the New Mexico desert. The reach of their trade network, for a society without writing, without metal tools, without draft animals or wheeled transport, is remarkable. The system required coordination across distance. It required people in outlying communities to produce surplus and transport it to Chaco. It required an ideological framework, almost certainly religious, that motivated that surplus extraction. And, like every system we've examined tonight, it was vulnerable when conditions changed. The change came as drought. Tree ring records from the American Southwest, which are among the most detailed in the world, extending back thousands of years, show a severe drought beginning around 1130 AD and persisting for decades. Chaco, already marginal in water resources, was hit hard. Construction activity at the great houses stopped. The flow of imported goods slowed and then ceased. And over the following decades, the canyon was gradually depopulated. But the people didn't die, they moved. Many migrated north to the Mesa Verde region in southwestern Colorado, where springs and seeps in the sandstone cliffs provided more reliable water. There, over the following century, they built the famous cliff dwellings, communities of stone rooms, towers, and kivas tucked into natural alcoves in the canyon walls. Mesa Verde's Cliff Palace, with its 150 rooms and 23 kivas, is the most iconic of these, but there are hundreds of smaller sites throughout the region. The cliff dwellings themselves are remarkable constructions. Tucked into natural sandstone alcoves, many of them south-facing to capture winter sunlight and stay cool in summer, they were built with dressed stone walls, plastered interiors, and careful attention to the structural constraints of building in a rock overhang. Some of the alcoves are hundreds of feet wide and dozens of feet deep. The buildings within them reached multiple stories, with room blocks, storage areas, kivas, and towers arranged in tight, efficient layouts. Access was often difficult. Ladders and hand- and toe-hold trails carved into the cliff face, which has led some archaeologists to suggest that the cliff dwellings were chosen partly for their defensibility. In a period of increasing conflict, being hard to reach was an advantage. Mesa Verde flourished for roughly a century and a half, and then it too was abandoned. The Great Drought of 1276 to 1299, one of the most severe droughts in 2,000 years of tree ring records, pushed the communities past their limit. And the archaeological record from this final period at Mesa Verde and the broader Four Corners region shows something else as well. Evidence of violence. Burned structures, unburied bodies, skeletal remains showing signs of lethal trauma. At some sites, evidence that has been cautiously interpreted as possible cannibalism. The causes are debated. Competition over dwindling water and food resources during the drought is the most common explanation. The social fabric that had held communities together for generations, shared ceremonies, reciprocal obligations, a common ideological framework, may have frayed as conditions worsened. When the system no longer delivered what it promised, the bonds that sustained it weakened. Conflict filled the gap. But even from this period of real hardship and real violence, the survivors moved on. They migrated south and east, to the Rio Grande Valley, to the Zuni area, to the Hopi Mesas. And there they built the Pueblo communities that the Spanish encountered when they arrived in the 16th century. Communities that are still there today. And this is where the Ancestral Puebloan story offers something unique among all the cases we're discussing tonight. The Hopi and Zuni don't just have archaeological evidence linking them to the Ancestral Puebloans. They have oral histories, migration stories passed down across generations that describe specific journeys from specific places. Some of these traditions mention Chaco, or describe it in terms that match what archaeologists have found. The Hopi have a word for Chaco, Yupkoivi, which has been translated as something like a place beyond the horizon where many people once gathered. They know what it was. They know their ancestors were there, and they know why they left. When Hopi and Zuni elders have been consulted about the abandoned sites in the Four Corners region, their response has been, in essence, those are our ancestors' places. They lived there for a time. They moved because conditions changed, and because the spiritual purpose of being there had been fulfilled. The moving wasn't a failure. It was part of the journey, part of the design. There's a specific detail from the archaeological record that brings this story into sharp focus. At several late Pueblo sites in the Rio Grande Valley, archaeologists have found kivas, the same ceremonial rooms that were central to community life at Chaco and Mesa Verde. The kivas in the Rio Grande are architecturally distinct from the earlier ones, adapted to new materials and new conditions, but they serve the same function and occupy the same position in community life. The tradition was carried forward. The migrants didn't arrive as refugees who had lost everything. They arrived as communities that had carried their ceremonial architecture, their ritual calendar, their social organization, and their agricultural knowledge with them across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. They weren't starting over, they were continuing. And at Hopi, the migration tradition is embedded in the very structure of village life. Different clans arrived at the mesas at different times, from different directions, and the order of their arrival is remembered in the assignment of clan lands, the sequence of ceremonial responsibilities, and the physical arrangement of houses within the villages. The village itself is a record of the migrations. You can read the history of the journey in the layout of the community. In the Hopi understanding, the history of the people is a history of migrations. They speak of moving through successive worlds, each one eventually left behind as the people continue their journey toward a place of balance. The abandoned great houses and cliff dwellings aren't ruins in the tragic Western sense. They're waypoints, chapters in a story that continues. And when you look at the archaeological evidence alongside those oral traditions, the standard collapse narrative dissolves. What happened wasn't a mysterious catastrophe. It was a series of migrations driven by environmental change, each one carrying people to new places, each one representing an adaptation, a response, a choice. The system at Chaco simplified. The system at Mesa Verde simplified further. But the people, their culture, their languages, their ceremonies, their memory, endured. And they endure today, intact and living, on the mesas and in the river valleys where they settled 700 years ago. But what about a place where migration wasn't really an option? A tiny island, 63 square miles, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. A place where the story we've been told is the opposite of survival, where we've been told the people destroyed themselves. Easter Island, Rapa Nui. A small triangle of volcanic rock in the southeastern Pacific, so isolated that when Polynesian navigators first reached it, probably between 800 and 1200 AD, the exact date is debated, they had crossed more than 1,000 miles of open ocean from the nearest inhabited islands to the west. They came in double-hulled sailing canoes, carrying seeds, chickens and rats. They found a small, forested island with no mammals, no amphibians, and no natural harbour. And they stayed, because turning around wasn't really an option. And they built the moai, nearly 900 of them. Enormous stone statues, carved from compressed volcanic ash at the quarry of Rano Raraku, an extinct volcanic crater on the island's eastern side. The moai range in height from a few feet to more than 30 feet. The heaviest completed and transported moai weighs around 82 tons. Some of the unfinished ones at the quarry are even larger. One, still partially attached to the bedrock, would have stood over 60 feet tall and weighed approximately 270 tons if completed. The quarry itself, Rano Raraku, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. Nearly 400 moai remain there in various stages of completion, some barely roughed out, some nearly finished, some standing upright in the soil as if waiting to be collected. The quarry face shows the technique clearly. The carvers worked from the top down, sculpting the front and sides of the statue while it was still attached to the bedrock by a keel along its back. When the carving was finished, the keel was chipped away, and the statue slid down the slope on a bed of rubble. They were carved with basalt handpicks, their features refined in the quarry, and then somehow transported, sometimes miles, to stone platforms called ahu around the island's perimeter, where they were erected facing inland, their backs to the sea. Why inland? Because according to Rapa Nui tradition, the moai embody the mana, the spiritual power, of important ancestors. They face the villages they protect, radiating their power inward, watching over the living community. They are not monuments to vanity, they are guardians, and their construction was an act of devotion, not hubris. Now here is the story that most people know about Easter Island, because it's the story that Jared Diamond told in his 2005 book, Collapse, and it became one of the most influential parables of environmental destruction in modern culture. The story goes like this. The Rapa Nui cut down their forests to make rollers and sledges for transporting the moai. Without trees, they couldn't build ocean-going canoes, cutting off their access to deep-sea fish. Without trees, the soil eroded. Without soil, crops failed. The population, which had grown to perhaps 10,000 or even 15,000 people, crashed. The society descended into warfare, famine, and possibly cannibalism. The moai were toppled during internecine conflicts. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, they found a degraded landscape inhabited by a desperate, diminished people living among the monuments of their own folly. It's a brilliant, cautionary tale. The problem is that a substantial portion of it appears to be wrong. Start with the deforestation. Rapa Nui was indeed once covered in palm forest, primarily a species related to the Chilean wine palm, and the palms are indeed gone. But research published over the last 2 decades by archaeologists including Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo has demonstrated that the Polynesian rat, Rattus exulans, played a critical, possibly dominant role in preventing forest regeneration. Rats eat palm seeds and palm seedlings. They don't cut trees down, but they prevent new trees from growing. Introduce rats to an island covered in palms, and over centuries, as old trees die and no new ones replace them, the forest gradually disappears. The islanders certainly used wood for construction, for cooking, for boats, and they cleared land for agriculture. But attributing the deforestation solely or even primarily to human logging overlooks the rats. And the population collapse? Diamond's narrative relies on a pre-contact population estimate of 10,000 to 15,000 or higher, followed by a dramatic crash. But more recent archaeological surveys, based on careful analysis of habitation sites, agricultural features, and the island's carrying capacity, suggest that the pre-contact population was significantly smaller, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people. If the peak population was 3,000 to 4,000, rather than 10,000 to 15,000, the narrative of catastrophic overshoot and crash loses much of its force. The Rapa Nui were skilled farmers. They practiced a form of agriculture called lithic mulching, breaking volcanic rock into small pieces and spreading it on garden surfaces. This technique reduces soil evaporation, increases soil temperature stability, and slowly releases minerals as the rock weathers. Recent research has shown that lithic mulching was remarkably effective, capable of sustaining productive agriculture on the island for centuries. The Rapa Nui also built stone-walled enclosures called manavai to protect their crops from wind. They cultivated sweet potatoes, taro, yams, and sugarcane. They raised chickens. They fished from the shore and in shallow coastal waters. Were they resource-constrained? Certainly. It's a small island with limited resources, but the evidence increasingly suggests that they managed those resources with considerable skill, not that they recklessly destroyed them. And the moai? Recent experimental work has demonstrated that the statues could have been moved by relatively small teams, using ropes to rock them from side to side in an upright position, walking them along prepared roads. This technique doesn't require log rollers. It doesn't require massive deforestation. It requires skill, coordination, strong rope, and a reasonably smooth road surface. The Rapa Nui themselves have a traditional explanation. They say the moai walked. Maybe they were being more literal than anyone realized. And then there's Rongorongo. Sometime in their history, exactly when is unknown, the Rapa Nui developed a writing system. Or perhaps a proto-writing system, or a mnemonic device for oral recitation. We don't know, because we can't read it. Rongorongo consists of symbols carved into wooden tablets in a distinctive boustrophedon pattern. Each alternate line is upside down relative to the one above it, so that a reader would rotate the tablet 180 degrees at the end of each line. The symbols depict humans, animals, plants, geometric shapes, and composite figures. About 600 distinct signs have been identified across the roughly 24 surviving tablets and fragments. Multiple attempts at decipherment have been made since the 19th century. None have succeeded. The corpus is too small, and the last people who could read Rongo Rongo died in the aftermath of the slave raids of the 1860s. A loss of knowledge that is directly attributable not to ecological collapse, but to colonial violence. If the Peruvian slavers hadn't come, Rongo Rongo might still be a living script. Instead, it sits in museums, beautiful and mute. Some researchers have also challenged the notion that the Rapa Nui experienced severe internal warfare prior to European contact. While there is archaeological evidence of conflict, obsidian spear points called mata are found in large numbers, and some moai were toppled before European arrival. The interpretation of this evidence is contested. Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo have argued that the mata were more likely agricultural tools than weapons, based on their shape, weight distribution, and use-wear patterns. The toppling of some moai may reflect changes in religious practice or inter-clan competition rather than all-out war. The standard narrative of a society tearing itself apart may be another layer of the myth that needs re-examination. So, if Easter Island wasn't the site of a self-inflicted ecological catastrophe, what actually happened to the Rapa Nui? The answer is painfully simple and painfully well documented. Europeans happened. The first European contact was in 1722, when Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday, hence the name Easter Island. His crew's accounts describe a functioning, if small, society. The people were described as healthy, their fields were cultivated, and many moai were still standing on their platforms. Subsequent European visits, Spanish in 1770, British under Captain Cook in 1774, confirmed a living, functioning society, though Cook noted that some moai had been toppled, possibly during inter-clan conflicts. And then came the catastrophe. In 1862 and 1863, Peruvian slave ships descended on Rapa Nui and kidnapped between 1,000 and 1,500 people, perhaps a third or more of the entire population. They were taken to Peru to work extracting guano, bird droppings used as fertilizer, on the Chincha Islands and as domestic laborers. The conditions were brutal. Most of the kidnapped Rapa Nui died in captivity, when international pressure, particularly from the French government, forced Peru to repatriate the survivors. Only 15 Rapa Nui made it back to the island alive. And they brought smallpox with them. The conditions the enslaved Rapa Nui endured were appalling. The guano mines on the Chincha Islands were essentially open-air labor camps. Workers breathed ammonia-laden dust, lived in makeshift shelters, and had no medical care. The death rate was staggering. Of the 1,500 or so Rapa Nui who were taken, the vast majority died within months. When the French government, alerted by missionaries in the Pacific, pressured Peru to repatriate the survivors, only a few hundred were still alive. They were loaded onto ships for the return journey. Most of them died at sea. Only 15 out of 1,500 made it back to the island. And those 15 were carrying smallpox. The disease had been circulating among the enslaved laborers in Peru, and the survivors brought it home with them. The epidemic that followed devastated the remaining population. By the 1870s, the Rapa Nui numbered roughly 111 people. 111 on an island that had sustained thousands for centuries. Among those who died were the island's Ariki, its chiefs, and its Rongo Rongo experts, the specialists who could read the island's unique script, a system of incised wooden tablets that remains undeciphered to this day. With their deaths, the ability to read Rongo Rongo was lost. This was the real collapse of Rapa Nui. And its cause was not ecological hubris. It was external violence, slavery, epidemic disease, and colonial exploitation, inflicted by outsiders on a small, isolated population that had no defense against it. And yet, from those 111 survivors, the Rapa Nui rebuilt. Today, the island's population includes roughly 7,800 Rapa Nui people. The language is still spoken, though it's classified as endangered. Cultural practices are being revived. The moai, many of them re-erected with international assistance, once again stand on their ahu, facing the villages, protecting the communities. The recovery itself is a story of extraordinary resilience. From those 111 survivors, the Rapa Nui population began slowly growing again under Chilean sovereignty, though the colonial period brought its own hardships, including confinement to a small area of the island, while the rest was leased to a sheep ranching company. Full Chilean citizenship for the Rapa Nui didn't come until the mid-20th century. Yet through all of it, the slave raids, the epidemic, the colonial confinement, the Rapa Nui maintained their identity, their language, their connection to the moai and the ahu, and the stories that explain them. Today, the Tapati Rapa Nui Festival, held every February, celebrates Rapa Nui culture with competitions in traditional carving, singing, dancing, reed boat racing, and body painting. It's not a museum reconstruction. It's a living celebration of a culture that refused to die. The Rapa Nui refused to disappear. They were nearly erased, not by their own choices, but by the choices of others. And they came back. And the narrative that blames them for their own destruction, that turns their history into a morality play about human greed, is not just inaccurate. It erases the real history of what happened to them. It replaces a story of colonial violence and indigenous resilience with a story of native self-destruction. And that replacement, that substitution of a comfortable parable for a painful truth, is itself a form of erasure. We've now walked through 6 civilizations: the Bronze Age Mediterranean, the classic Maya, the Khmer of Angkor, the Harappans of the Indus Valley, the Ancestral Puebloans, and the Rapa Nui. And in every case, the same pattern emerges from beneath the word collapse. The political system ended. The monumental buildings stopped. The cities emptied out. But the people survived. They migrated, adapted, simplified, remembered, and continued. In every single case, collapse turns out to describe the death of a system, not the death of a people. So, the question that's been building all night: why do we keep telling it wrong? What is it about the collapse narrative that makes it so persistent, so seductive, so resistant to the evidence? Let's think about what makes the collapse narrative so compelling. Because it is compelling. There's a reason books about civilizational collapse become bestsellers, and documentaries about mysterious disappearances fill television schedules year after year. Something about the image of a great civilization falling grips us in a way that the more accurate story, gradual transformation, complex causation, persistent survival, simply doesn't. Part of the appeal is narrative. We are storytelling creatures, and we like our stories to have clean arcs. A civilization that rises, peaks, and collapses is a satisfying narrative. It has structure. It has drama. It has a moral. It functions like a Greek tragedy. Hubris, followed by nemesis, followed by downfall. The meaning is clear. Pride comes before a fall. A civilization that rises, reaches a point of diminishing returns, gradually simplifies over several generations, while its population disperses into smaller communities that continue to practice many of the same cultural traditions. That's not a story in the conventional sense. It doesn't have a climax. It doesn't have a clear villain or a decisive turning point. It doesn't resolve neatly into a lesson. And because it doesn't provide the narrative satisfaction we crave, we reshape it. We compress decades into moments. we single out one cause from a dozen interacting factors. We treat migration as extinction. We apply the word collapse to make it feel like a proper ending. There's also something in the collapse narrative that flatters us. It positions us, modern, industrial, technologically advanced us, as the survivors, the ones who got it right. If the Maya collapsed and we didn't, there must be something superior about our approach. If Angkor failed and our cities still stand, we must be doing something better. The collapse narrative turns other civilizations into cautionary tales and our civilization into the success story. It draws a line between them, the ones who failed, and us, the ones who succeeded. And that line is comforting, even though it's based on a comparison that doesn't hold up. Our own civilization is roughly 300 years old, counting from the Industrial Revolution. Many of the collapsed civilizations we've discussed tonight lasted far longer. The classic Maya period lasted 650 years. The Khmer Empire lasted 6 centuries. The Indus civilization lasted 700 years or more. If endurance is the measure, they outperformed us by a wide margin. We simply haven't been at it long enough to know how our story ends. Part of the appeal is also about us, about the present. We live in a complex, interconnected, resource-intensive global civilization. We can feel the stress points: climate change, biodiversity loss, freshwater depletion, political polarization, the visible fragility of supply chains. And when we look at the past and see civilizations that collapsed, we're really looking for a mirror. We're asking, could it happen to us? Will it happen to us? And the collapse narrative gives us a clear, dramatic, emotionally satisfying answer. Yes, exactly like this, suddenly, totally, inescapably. But that answer, satisfying in its clarity, is misleading in its simplicity, because it didn't happen like that. It never happened like that. Every process we've examined tonight unfolded over decades or centuries, not days or years. Every process involved multiple interacting causes, not single decisive blows. And every process ended, not in extinction, but in transformation, adaptation, and survival. Tainter's framework offers a different lens. If the simplification of a complex society is a rational response to diminishing returns, if people are making reasonable choices based on the costs and benefits available to them, then what we call collapse is not a catastrophe visiting itself upon helpless victims. It's a process in which people exercise agency. Constrained agency, certainly, shaped by drought and war and environmental change, but agency nonetheless. The farmer who walks away from the king's pyramid is not a passive victim of historical forces. He's a person making a decision about his own life. And the evidence supports this. The Maya farmers who dispersed from the cities continued to farm. Many of them farmed successfully for centuries after the collapse. The Khmer who moved to Phnom Penh built a capital that has endured to the present. The Ancestral Puebloans who left Mesa Verde for the Rio Grande and the Hopi Mesas found new homes that suited the changed conditions. The post-collapse lives of these people were not universally miserable. In some cases, they may have been improvements, simpler, less burdened by the demands of an extractive elite, more closely scaled to the actual carrying capacity of the landscape. The post-classic Maya world, for instance, wasn't a wasteland. Northern cities like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan were politically active and economically vibrant. Coastal trading networks carried obsidian, salt, cacao, and cotton across the peninsula. People built temples, conducted ceremonies, and maintained the calendar systems that connected them to their classic period heritage. The word Dark Age, or collapse, applied to this period, says more about our expectations than about their reality. And the post-Bronze Age world produced the Phoenician alphabet, iron metallurgy, and the cultural foundations of classical Greece. The Dark Age was an incubation period, not a death. There's also a cultural dimension to the appeal of collapse narratives that's worth acknowledging. The Western intellectual tradition, from which most collapse scholarship originally emerged, has a deep attachment to the idea of cyclical decline. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire wasn't just a history. It was a morality tale about the consequences of corruption, luxury, and the loss of civic virtue. Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, published in 1918, argued that civilizations were like organisms. They were born, they grew, they matured, and they inevitably died. Arnold Toynbee's multi-volume A Study of History proposed that civilizations rose through challenge and response, and fell when their elites became a dominant minority that could no longer inspire creative responses to new challenges. These frameworks are deeply embedded in how we think about the past. They predispose us to see endings rather than transformations. They make us look for the moment of death rather than the process of adaptation. And they carry an implicit assumption that's worth making explicit: the idea that the civilized state is the normal one and the post-collapse state is an aberration, a falling away from how things should be. But what if it's the other way around? What if the normal human condition is the smaller scale, more flexible, more decentralized community, and the large, centralized, monumental state is the exception? Impressive, certainly, but inherently temporary. Tainter's work points in this direction. If complex societies exist to solve problems, and if the cost of solving problems through complexity eventually exceeds the benefit, then simplification is not a pathology. It's a correction. The system was running at a level of complexity that was no longer efficient, and it returned to a level that was. That's not a tragedy. That's homeostasis. The deepest problem with the collapse narrative may be one of visibility. Archaeology has a systematic bias toward the dramatic, the monumental, the complex. Stone pyramids survive. Thatched roof farmhouses don't. The archaeological signature of a divine king commissioning a limestone temple is enormous. The archaeological signature of a farming family living quietly in the countryside after the temples have been abandoned is tiny. We see the moment when the monumental building stops, because that moment is archaeologically deafening. We struggle to see what comes after because it's archaeologically quiet. The collapse is loud, the survival is silent, and our attention goes to the noise. Modern archaeology has become increasingly aware of this bias. Researchers are devoting more attention to post-collapse periods, the centuries after the urban centers emptied, when people were still living, farming, trading, and adapting. And what they're finding is that these periods are far more dynamic and far more interesting than the standard narrative suggests. There's a concept in ecology called resilience, the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change, while retaining essentially the same function, structure, and identity. Ecologists distinguish resilience from stability. A stable system resists change. A resilient system absorbs change and adapts. A forest that grows back after a fire is resilient. A dam that holds against flooding is stable. The difference matters because stability is brittle. When a stable system finally breaks, it breaks catastrophically. Resilience is flexible. It bends, deforms, transforms, and recovers. The civilizations we've talked about tonight were not stable. Their specific political forms, their specific architectural traditions, their specific economic arrangements, those changed dramatically and sometimes painfully. But the cultures, the peoples, the languages, the agricultural knowledge, those proved resilient. They absorbed the shock, they reorganized, and they continued. Modern archaeology has increasingly adopted language from resilience theory to describe what happens during civilizational transitions. Researchers like Patricia McAnany and Norman Yoffe, in their influential 2010 volume, questioning collapse, explicitly challenge the collapse framework, and argue for language that captures transformation and persistence rather than death and ending. Their argument isn't that nothing bad happened. The droughts were real, the wars were real, the suffering was real. The argument is that framing these events as collapses privileges the dramatic ending over the messy, complicated, but ultimately more important story of what happened next. And what happened next, in case after case, was life. Continued, adapted, transformed, sometimes diminished in some dimensions and enriched in others, but life. Human beings doing what human beings do, adjusting, improvising, remembering, and persisting. And this brings us to the last thought of the night. We've traveled through a lot of territory tonight. 5,000 years, 4 continents, 6 civilizations, each of which has been labeled at some point with the word collapse. And in every single case, when we look past the word and into the evidence, the same quiet truth emerges. The systems end. The people don't. The Bronze Age palace system fell, and the Greeks entered a period of simplification, from which they emerged with the alphabet, iron tools, and the foundations of Western philosophy. The classic Maya political system of divine kings and competing city-states unraveled, and 6 million Maya continue to live, speak their languages, tend their milpas, and perform their ceremonies today. The Khmer left Angkor for Phnom Penh, and 16 million Cambodians carry the cultural inheritance forward. The Indus cities emptied out, and their people migrated east, contributing strands to the fabric of Indian civilization that can still be detected today. The Ancestral Puebloans left Chaco and Mesa Verde and became the Hopi and Zuni, who remember the journeys their ancestors made and understand those journeys as part of a larger spiritual design. The Rapa Nui survived slavery, smallpox, and the near-total destruction of their population, and they're still on their island, still speaking their language, still living with the Moai. And there's something else worth noting. In several of these cases, the post-collapse period produced innovations that the complex system itself had been unable or unwilling to generate. The Bronze Age collapse led to the alphabet, iron metallurgy, and eventually to classical Greek culture, arguably the most influential cultural tradition in Western history. The collapse of centralized Maya kingship in the southern lowlands was followed by a more decentralized, trade-oriented political order in the north and along the coast that proved in many ways more adaptable than the classic system. The Ancestral Puebloans' migration from Chaco and Mesa Verde to the Rio Grande and the Hopi Mesas led to new agricultural techniques better suited to the changed climate, and to political structures based on clan councils rather than centralized authority. Structures that proved remarkably durable, surviving not just the climate changes that had ended the Chaco system, but also, centuries later, the pressures of Spanish colonialism. Complexity, for all its benefits, can also be a constraint. It locks societies into specific patterns, specific dependencies, specific ways of doing things. When conditions change, the complex system's very specialization can become a liability. It's optimized for a world that no longer exists. Simplification, painful as it may be, can unlock new possibilities. It frees people to experiment, to try different approaches, to adapt to the world as it actually is, rather than the world the old system was designed for. In every case, what collapsed was a specific arrangement of power, infrastructure, and ideology, a particular way of organizing a complex society. And in every case, the people who had lived within that arrangement found new ways to live when the old way became unsustainable. Sometimes the transition was brutal, sometimes it was gradual, sometimes it involved real deprivation and suffering. But the thread of culture, language, memory, identity, held. And maybe that's the most honest thing anyone can say about what we call civilizational collapse. Civilizations don't really die. The forms they take, the temples, the bureaucracies, the trade networks, the monumental ambitions, those forms are temporary. They arise to meet specific conditions and solve specific problems, and when the conditions change or the solutions become too expensive, the forms dissolve. But the people, the languages, the agricultural knowledge, the stories, the patterns woven into cloth and pressed into clay and whispered to children at bedtime, those are more durable than any pyramid. They bend where stone breaks. They flow where walls crumble. They carry forward. The Hopi have a way of thinking about this that the archaeological evidence remarkably supports. In their understanding, the world has gone through phases. Each phase has its time. When a phase ends, the people carry what matters into the next one. The abandoned places are not failures. They are completed chapters. Their purpose was served. And the journey continues. There's something in that perspective that our word collapse utterly fails to capture. Collapse sees only the ending. The Hopi perspective sees the continuation. And the evidence, the actual archaeological, climatological, genetic, linguistic evidence, supports the continuation more than it supports the ending. So, maybe we need a different word, something that captures the complexity of what actually happens when a civilization transforms. Something that acknowledges both the real loss, the writing systems forgotten, the knowledge buried, the suffering endured, and the real survival. A word that holds the pain and the persistence in the same breath. Until we find that word, we can at least be more careful with the one we have. We can say, when we talk about the Maya, that their classic period political system underwent a major transformation. We can note that the cities were abandoned, but that the people continued. We can acknowledge the droughts and the wars and the systemic stresses, while also acknowledging the agency of the people who responded to those stresses by adapting, migrating, and rebuilding. We can tell the truth, which is more complicated than collapse, but more respectful and more accurate. And the truth matters. Not just for its own sake, but because the stories we tell about the past shape what we believe is possible in the future. If we believe civilizations inevitably collapse, suddenly, totally, mysteriously, then we face our own challenges with a kind of paralyzed dread. We look at climate change and think, this is how it ends. If we understand that what actually happens is transformation, painful, slow, involving real loss but also real survival, then we face those challenges with something different, something more useful, something closer to hope. And maybe that's the final lesson, worth carrying forward. The question isn't whether complex systems can fail. They can. They have. They will. The Bronze Age trade network failed. The classic Maya political system failed. The Angkorian hydraulic system failed. These were real failures with real consequences. But the question we should be asking isn't, can our system fail? Of course it can. But rather, what survives the failure? What do we carry forward? What do we protect? The things that survived in every case we've examined were not the monumental, the impressive, the photogenic. They weren't the pyramids or the reservoirs or the diplomatic networks. Those were the first things to go. What survived were the things that were woven most deeply into daily life. The way people grew food, the way they spoke to each other, the way they raised their children, the stories they told, the ceremonies they performed, the small, quiet, daily practices that didn't depend on a functioning state or a full treasury. Those were the durable things. Those were the things that bent instead of breaking. There's a kind of hierarchy of durability in human culture. States are fragile. Cities are fragile. Trade networks are fragile. But languages are tough. Agricultural knowledge is tough. Kinship systems are tough. Spiritual practices are tough, songs are tough, stories are incredibly tough. The Homeric poems survived 3 centuries of the Greek Dark Ages without writing, carried in the memories of professional storytellers who spent their lives learning and reciting them. The Hopi migration stories have survived 700 years of oral transmission. The Maya calendar system has survived the destruction of all but 4 of their books. Human memory is more resilient than human infrastructure. That's a strange thought, but the evidence survived it. The Maya survived drought. The Khmer survived the failure of their water system and the armies of Ayutthaya. The Ancestral Puebloans survived the worst drought in 2,000 years and the violence that accompanied it. The Rapa Nui survived slavery, epidemic, and near annihilation. In every case, they survived by simplifying, adapting, moving, and remembering. And they're still here. That's the part we keep forgetting. That's the part the word collapse keeps hiding. They're still here. So, here you are, lying in the dark, settling in, and all around you, right now, the descendants of every civilization we've talked about tonight are alive. In Guatemala, a Maya woman is setting corn to soak in lime water. The process is called nixtamalization, and it was invented so long ago that no one remembers who figured it out. The lime breaks down the cell walls of the corn kernel, releases nutrients that would otherwise be locked away, and transforms the texture into something that can be ground into masa and pressed into tortillas. It's chemistry, practiced for millennia without anyone calling it that. Her great-grandmother did this. Her great-grandmother's great-grandmother did this. The technique predates the classic period. It predates the cities. It will outlast whatever comes next. In Cambodia, a Buddhist monk is chanting at a temple in Phnom Penh. The tradition he practices descends from Jayavarman VII, who built the Bayon and filled Angkor with smiling stone faces 800 years ago. The spiritual lineage is unbroken. The language of the chant is Pali, but the monk's everyday language is Khmer, descended from the old Khmer inscriptions at Angkor, readable across a millennium and a half. In Arizona, a Hopi elder is telling a grandchild about the migrations, about the places the people lived before they came to the Mesas, about Chaco, the place where many people once gathered, about Mesa Verde and the cliffs, about the drought and the journey and the arrival. The story has been told this way, or something close to this way, for 700 years. It's not a legend, it's a family history. The grandchild will tell it to their own grandchild someday. On Rapa Nui, a teacher is leading a class in the island's indigenous language. The language nearly died. 111 people, and with them the last speakers who could read Rongo Rongo. But the language survived, barely, and now it's being taught again, spoken again, carried forward again. The Moai stand on their ahu, facing the villages, doing what they've always done, watching over the people, protecting them, reminding them where they came from. In Greece, a language is being spoken that descends through an unbroken chain of daily use across more than 3,000 years from the tongue of the Mycenaean palace scribes who wrote in Linear B. The grammar has shifted. The vocabulary has evolved. But the thread of descent from those Bronze Age administrators, through the Dark Age, through classical and Hellenistic, and Byzantine and Ottoman periods, to modern Greek, is continuous. The collapse of the Mycenaean palaces didn't sever the linguistic connection. It couldn't. Languages live in mouths, not in palaces. Somewhere in the Indian subcontinent, a potter is shaping clay with techniques that have been practiced in the region for thousands of years. The connection to Mohenjo-Daro may be unprovable in strict academic terms. The Indus script remains silent, but the continuity of craft, the continuity of presence, the fact that people have been living and working in this landscape for an unbroken 5,000 years, that continuity is its own kind of evidence. Not proof of specific descent, but proof of persistence. Proof that the people didn't go away. These are the ghosts that aren't ghosts. The dead that didn't die. The collapsed that never collapsed. Not really. Not in the way the word implies. They're the argument against every headline that asks, what happened to the Maya? As if the Maya had gone somewhere. They're right there. They've always been there. And if you ask them, they'll tell you, we didn't disappear. We changed. We moved. We adapted. We simplified when we had to and rebuilt when we could. We lost things along the way. Writing systems, political structures, architectural traditions, knowledge that took centuries to accumulate. Those losses were real. They mattered. But we survived them. We carried forward what was most important. And we're still here. The ruins are beautiful. I won't pretend they're not. There's something deeply moving about Tikal at dawn, when the mist clings to the trees and the pyramid temples rise above the canopy like the spines of some immense sleeping creature. There's something haunting about Angkor Wat in the late afternoon light, when the sandstone turns gold and the bas-reliefs of Apsaras seem to breathe. There's something almost unbearable about Chaco Canyon in the silence of a winter afternoon, the sun low and the shadows long across walls built with such precision by hands whose names we will never know. But those ruins are not tombstones. They're markers, waypoints along a journey. They mark the places where people gathered, built, prayed, argued, danced, sacrificed, calculated the movements of the stars, and then, when the time came, decided to move on. The moving on. The quiet, undramatic, profoundly human decision to leave behind what no longer sustains you and to seek what might. That's the part of the story worth remembering. Because the systems come and go. The pyramids rise and the pyramids are abandoned. The reservoirs fill and the reservoirs silt up. The kings proclaim and the kings are forgotten. All of that is temporary. All of that seen from the long perspective of human history is weather. But the people remain. The thread holds. The seeds are saved and replanted. The languages persist, sometimes barely, sometimes against tremendous odds, but they persist. The ceremonies continue. The stories are told, retold, adapted, carried forward across centuries by the quiet, relentless, stubbornly hopeful persistence of human beings who refuse to stop being human. That's the thought to drift off with tonight. Not the dramatic collapse, not the mystery, not the moai staring silently across a lonely sea, but the persistence. The fact that people, when the rains stop and the systems fail and the cities empty out, do what they have always done. They pick up their children. They gather what they can carry. They remember what they need to remember. And they walk into the next chapter. And the next chapter always comes. So, let that settle. Let it be a slow, quiet thing in the back of your mind. The world is full of ruins, and every one of them is surrounded by the living descendants of the people who built them. The past is less dead than it looks. The present is less fragile than it feels. And the future, whatever it brings, will be carried forward by the same stubborn, adaptive, endlessly creative species that has been carrying it forward for 300,000 years. The ghosts are still alive. They've always been alive. And maybe the most important thing we can do, tonight and going forward, is to stop calling them ghosts. They're just people, like us, doing what people do. Good night.